Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. We now come to the Opposition Day motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition relating to parliamentary scrutiny of the UK leaving the European Union. I inform the House that I have selected Amendment B in the name of the Prime Minister. To move the motion, I call the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Keir Starmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I start with something that I think we can all agree on at the outset of this debate? The decisions that are going to be taken by the government over the next few months and years in relation to exiting the EU are going to have a profound implication for the future of this country, for its economy, for its people, and for its place in the world. We've probably never seen such a set of significant decisions as are going to be made in this period since the end of the Second World War. Today's debate is about the proper role of Parliament, and this House in particular, throughout that process. It's about scrutiny and it's about accountability. Mr. Speaker, there was one question on the ballot paper on the 23rd of June of this year, and it was this: should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? The majority of those voting voted to leave. That result has to be accepted and respected, notwithstanding that many, including myself, campaigned for Remain. But that is not the end of the matter. The next and increasingly pressing question is, on what terms should we leave the EU? That question was not on the ballot paper, nor was it addressed in the Conservative Party's 2015 manifesto. There was no plan B in the event of the referendum being concluded with a leave vote. Nor did the Prime Minister set out her terms for Brexit before assuming office, because of the nature of the exercise by which she assumed that office.
No election, no vote.
Nor do we have a white paper setting out the proposed terms. Instead, hiding under the cloak of the prerogative, the Secretary of State has until now declined to give the House a meaningful role in scrutinising the government's opening terms for negotiation. And that matters. Now, I'm glad to see that there is a government amendment down, Amendment B, and that implies that the government is taking a step in the right direction towards scrutiny.
On that point?
Yes, please.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and I'm sure he welcomes, as I do, the half U-turn that we've seen from the government on this, allowing the debate before Article 50. But what about an actual vote? I'm concerned that the amendment in front of us doesn't mention a vote of this House before Article 50 is triggered, and that part has to be crucial.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I will come on to the question of vote, because I think that is important. But let's take one step at a time. There's scrutiny and there's accountability. And the first question is whether the Secretary of State is prepared to put before the House the plans so that the House can see them and debate them. Yes. There is then the next question, which is what can the House do about it, which is accountability. I hope that the amendment which has been tabled today indicates that the government is going further down the route of scrutiny than they've been prepared to so far. And if they are, I'm not going to crow about it, because I think that's the right thing to do, and it's in the national interest. And we all have a duty to make sure that we get the right result for the country.
Labour is going to set out how they would handle the negotiation.
We're not in government, that's the bit. We'll go over there and do it if you want.
I would happily swap places with the Secretary of State and play a part in the negotiation. But we are not in government, nor did... I'll answer the first intervention, please. Nor did we have in our manifesto a referendum without a plan for exit.
Yes.
And we need to be clear at the beginning of this exercise where responsibility for the position we find ourselves in today lies. And it lies with a previous Prime Minister and a government that had no plan for a no vote. That is why we're here today. I can only give way to one person at a time.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And you mentioned the terms, the terms of our exit and also national interest. Now, I come from a business background, and I'd love to get his sense on his approach to a successful negotiation. Does he believe the national interest will be best served by the government coming to this place and explaining in precise detail all its negotiating positions before we've even walked into the room?
Well, I will deal with that because that's obviously an essential question that we need to discuss this afternoon. And in a sense, I don't think this should be about point scoring across the House. No, I won't. We're debating a fundamental question. That is whether the basic plans for exiting or for the negotiating position are going to be put before the House or not. That really matters. Of course there's a degree of detail that can't be gone into. Of course there's a degree of flexibility that has to be there in any negotiation. Of course the starting position may not be the end position. We all accept that. We're all grown up. But the question here is whether the basic terms should be put before the House. Of course.
Doesn't know what to do with it.
Thank you. I also, like the gentleman, the honourable gentleman over there, had a business background, as of course does the Director General of the CBI, Caroline Fairbairn, and she said, at the moment, if the commentary was to read into what we've heard so far, it's that we're heading to something of a cliff edge in 2.5 years. Does he recognise, as I do, there's many people in businesses that are very, very concerned about the lack of commentary and the lack of direction we've got from the government?
I'm grateful for that intervention. There are two aspects of today's debate. Partly there's the political aspect, what is the role of Parliament? There is also the question of uncertainty, because it's absolutely clear that across business, across EU citizens and across the population as a whole, there is great uncertainty about what the plans are, and that uncertainty simply can't be kept in place for the next 3 years. It is growing uncertainty. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. I wonder if he could set out for the House what scrutiny there was of the Lisbon Treaty when that was ratified under the Gordon Brown government.
There is different scrutiny for different treaties and different provisions. One of the examples I'm going to draw attention to is the scrutiny that was provided in relation to the original decision to go into the EEC. Because then, as I'm sure the honourable member will know, command papers were put before the House. An economic impact assessment was put before the House, and some of those command papers were voted on. So the idea that it can't be done and wasn't done in the past is wrong. But I was going to give way to...
You mentioned uncertainty. I have been contacted by a business in my constituency today that has until recently been growing very rapidly and had plans to announce a £100,000 expansion this autumn. That's now been cancelled because of the uncertainty about our future in the single market, and what they see is the government's headlong rush to a hard Brexit. What can my honourable friend say about Labour's position to reassure those businesses across the whole of Britain that are worried about our future in the single market?
The priority should be the economy and jobs, and that means access to the single market. I'm going to just I'm going to make some progress, if I may. I've only got to page 2, and I've taken about 10 interventions already. So if you'll bear with me, I'll press on. On Monday, the Secretary of State confirmed that the Prime Minister will invoke Article 50 no later than the end of March of next year. unless Parliament has a meaningful role in shaping the terms of Brexit between now and then, a maximum of just over 5.5 months, it will be too late. Because I can see what's going to happen. Once the negotiating process is started, there will be a claim by the Secretary of State that it would be inappropriate to put anything before the House by way of detail. And once the process is over, any risks of any debate will be purely academic. Of course.
Simply on a point of information, that's not correct, and I've said that's not correct already. In talking to the Lords Committee in September, I said that the House would have at least information available to the European Parliament. So that would not be the case.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and I read the transcript of the Secretary of State's evidence to that select committee, because what was put to him was that the European Parliament on one view would have more answers than this Parliament, because in 2010, as he knows, there was a framework agreement between the Commission and the European Parliament which states, and I will just quote it, Parliament shall be immediately and fully informed at all stages of the negotiation and conclusion of international agreements, including the definition of the negotiating directives. Now that goes a long way further than I understood the Secretary of State's position to be on Monday and in his first statement. And if he can confirm now that at least that part of scrutiny is guaranteed, I'll be very pleased to take that confirmation.
I can.
Thank you.
Why did you say the opposite?
This, Mr. Speaker, this is not just a matter of process. This is a matter of real substance. Both those who voted to leave the EU and those who voted to remain recognise that different negotiating stances under Article 50 could provide radically different outcomes, each of which carry very significant risks and opportunities. That, of course, is why there is undoubtedly a keen debate going on behind the scenes on the government side, because everybody recognises the potential consequences of adopting the wrong opening stance. Yes, of course.
I thank my honourable and learned friend for giving way, and he's making an excellent case. Does he agree with me that the British people may have voted to leave the European Union, but what they didn't vote for is for their food to become more expensive, the wages of low-paid workers to be hit, and for jobs to be lost in the manufacturing, agricultural and banking sectors, which is what we are in danger of if we choose the wrong exit from the European Union?
I agree with that, and that's what's causing such great anxiety around the country. I doubt there's anyone in this House who hasn't had constituents, either individuals or businesses, approach them with real concerns about what the situation. There are different concerns from... I'm halfway through a sentence. There are different concerns from different businesses and different individuals, but I certainly haven't met any. If there are MPs who haven't, well, so be it. But I think the Secretary of State would recognise the deep levels of concern there are out there about the uncertainty of the future across the business community and across a number of individuals, groups and communities. Now, I'll give way.
Very grateful to my honourable friend. I'm sure I'm not alone in having many representations from individuals amongst the millions of EU citizens living in this country and, of course, Britons living abroad who are deeply insecure about their position. Does he agree with me that it is deplorable to discuss those individuals in the terms of being bargaining chips and cards that we need to play in negotiations? And do we not need to make a priority of ensuring that those individuals with their businesses and their lives have the security they deserve?
The honourable member makes a very good point, and again, I think many of us have had anxious conversations with EU citizens who simply want to know what their position is and want some guarantees about the future. Now, I will make some progress, Mr. Speaker. The models for exiting or some of the models for exiting have been much discussed. The most cited, I think, are the Norwegian model, the Swiss model, the Turkish model and the Canadian model. It is unlikely that any deal reached between the UK and the EU will replicate any of those models, nor should it. But in negotiating our future relationship with the EU, the government will be defining the future of our country. So the terms matter hugely. And it's frankly astonishing that the government proposes to devise the negotiating terms of our exit from the EU then to negotiate, and then to reach a deal without a vote in this House. And this is where the opening remarks I made become important, because absent anything in the manifesto, absent anything on the referendum ballot form, absent any words from the Prime Minister before she assumed office, where's the mandate? Nobody, public or in this House, no, the referendum is not the mandate for the terms. It's the terms. We've been round this block and everybody understands the distinction. I have accepted, I've stood here and accepted there's a mandate for exit. There is no mandate for the terms. It's never been put to the country. It's never been put to the country. It's not even been put to the Secretary of State's political party, and it's not been put to this House. Where is the mandate on the terms? I'll keep going.
Mr. Speaker, reference has been made to the Lisbon Treaty, which may provide a rather useful precedent. Does he aware that the policy towards that treaty was debated repeatedly on the floor of this House, beginning with the abortive European Constitution? The then government was accountable to this House for the view it was taking towards the treaty, and the treaty itself was then debated days on end on the floor of the House with repeated votes at several stages in that process. Nobody mentioned the words royal prerogative throughout the entire process.
I will come on to the prerogative, and I think it was debated, for at least 20 days. But this to divide, I will, and then I will make.
I'm grateful because the issue of the prerogative is absolutely key here, isn't it? Because in 1924, when there was a Labour government, we insisted that all treaties would be laid before this House for 21 days. So that this House and the House of Lords could take a view on them. That was the Ponsonby rule. When there was a Conservative government, they got rid of it. When there was a Labour government again in 1929, we put it back in, and in 2010 we put that on the statute books. Is it not really worrying that ministers have been going to the House of Lords and in this chamber and relying solely on the prerogative in relation to treaties?
It is, and I am going to deal with the prerogative in some detail, because the prerogative is not fixed. The prerogative changes over time. And in any event, even if the prerogative may legally allow the executive to proceed without scrutiny and accountability in this House, it doesn't prevent that scrutiny and accountability. It doesn't require the government to proceed in that way. It's being used as a cloak in order to avoid the scrutiny that is needed. But I will deal that. Mr. Speaker.
Shadow spokesman give way.
I will.
Some of us were here during the Maastricht Treaty, where there were many, many votes, and where the government forces of the day were brilliantly whipped by the present Secretary for Brexit in favour of the Maastricht Treaty. Now, just to be quite clear, the Honourable Gentleman, because I'm very much minded to support his motion, is calling for a vote on the terms, not just an examination, but a vote on the terms before we send the Secretary off to negotiate.
Yes. Absolutely, absolutely. But I do take it in two stages because both of them are important. Scrutiny, putting the plans before the House, really matters. There's a separate argument about a vote. And I say there should be a vote. But what we mustn't do is get to a situation where, in order to resist the vote, the Secretary of State won't even put the plans before the House. I will take that intervention.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Is it not the case that the Convention is very clearly established that a major treaty change has to be triggered by an affirmative resolution of this House? And the fact it may only be a convention is still something which must be respected, because after all there are lots of conventions, such as the convention, for example, that a government resigns if it loses a vote of no confidence is no more than a convention. But I think members of this House might be a bit surprised in those circumstances if a government were not to go.
Let me deal The prerogative has come up so often. I'm going to deal with it now in substance. Prerogative powers, of course, developed at a time when the monarch was both a feudal lord and head of state. That's the origin of prerogative powers. But they have changed over time, yielding, where necessary, to the demands of democratic accountability. And there are plenty of examples, as the Secretary of State will know, in the courts of that change and accountability. But there's also the example of the prerogative power to commit troops in armed conflict. In theory, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet retain the constitutional right to decide when and where to authorise action. But in practice, governments in recent times have ensured parliamentary debate and a vote. And responding to the Chilcot report, earlier this year on the 6th of July, the then Prime Minister made the point at PMQs when he said, and I quote, "I think we have now got a set of arrangements and conventions that put the country in a stronger position. I think it is now a clear convention that we have a vote in this House, which of course we did on Iraq before premeditated military action. A strong political convention modifying the prerogative has thus been set." Well, I'll just complete this section on the prerogative, if I may. But the underlying premise of the development of the prerogative is clear and it's obvious. The more significant the decision in question, and the more serious the possible consequences, the greater the need for meaningful parliamentary scrutiny. That's what lies at the heart of it. And it's hard to think of a more significant set of decisions with very serious consequences than the terms upon which we leave the EU. And I will press on this point because all of this is well known to the Secretary of State. After all, he tabled the 10-minute rule bill in June 1999, which were concerned with the exercise of certain powers of ministers of the Crown subject to control by the House of Commons. When he introduced that bill on the 22nd of June 1999, the Right Honourable Member, now of course Secretary of State, said, and I just will quote him, his own approach to the prerogative.
Yes.
Executive decisions by the government should be subject to the scrutiny and approval of Parliament in many other areas. The bill sets out to make the prerogative subject to parliamentary approval, giving Parliament the right of approval over all executive powers not conferred by statute, from the ratification of treaties to the approval of orders in Council, and from the appointment of European Commissioners, some ambassadors, members of the Bank of England, etc. And so the Secretary of State has changed his position. Back then he was recognising that the prerogative ought to be subject to Parliament. It was 20 years ago, but with the prerogative, the movement is usually in favour of the progressive movement in favour of greater accountability, not less. So the fact that 20 years ago is arguing that is not an argument against doing it now. That bill did not proceed, but the principles are clear and are set out. So the prerogative is not fixed. Parliamentary practice and parliamentary convention can change the prerogative. It has changed the prerogative in a number of ways. But in any event, I fall back on my primary point, which is even if the prerogative permits the government to withhold the plans from Parliament, it doesn't require it to. And political accountability requires the government to put its plans before the government. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman because I think he's missing one rather important fact, which there has been a vote. There has been a vote of the British people, a vote that was delegated to the to the British people by the terms of the Referendum Act. And the question he's got to answer, supposing there was a vote in this House, how would he vote? Would he vote against Article 50, invocation, or would he vote in favour? Just give a straight answer to that.
I'm not going to take long responding to that because I've made the point. The mandate on the 23rd of June was not a mandate as the terms. I can't put it any clearer than that. And I think most people understand that. I do just want to make this point because there is this question of how would you vote, what would you vote on, and what happens if Parliament doesn't like the terms. The Secretary of State, in his statement on the 5th of September, emphasised that he was going to consult widely, including the devolved countries, which of course are very important in all this and deserve scrutiny of the way it will impact in each of those countries. He said he would consult widely and I quote, strive to build a national consensus around our approach. So the question for the Secretary of State is, how are you going to build a consensus around your approach if you won't tell this House what your approach is? Yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to the honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. He is, of course, a first-rate lawyer of international renown. It's a real pleasure to hear him develop his argument. I'm interested in what he just said about the devolved administrations. Does he agree with me that the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations should have a central role in the negotiations on the UK's terms for exiting the European Union? And will he and his party throw their weight behind that argument?
I do agree with that, absolutely, and we will throw our weight behind it. I think, in fairness, the Prime Minister signalled that by her early visits as soon as she assumed the office. I was hesitant to answer that question in case I got relegated from second grade to third or even fourth grade lawyer, but I'll press on and intervene unless you're about to give me a ranking.
I was just about to say to the honourable gentleman that he will remember from Monday that I, how can I put it, reiterated the support for his standing as a lawyer.
I will give way. I will give way.
Can I'm going to. Can I unreservedly withdraw allegation I made on Monday only on the basis that it was clumsy, it was not meant about him, it was meant about advice, and I don't doubt for one moment his capabilities as a lawyer.
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I can assure him and the House that I wasn't in the slightest bit concerned. I'm very grateful to so many people who were concerned, but I myself was not in the slightest bit concerned. I consider the matter closed. But I do... This question of the role of the House... No, I will press on because I'm conscious there are very, very many people who want to come in. I hope I'm not going to get relegated straight away.
Question. He said just now that it was important for the government to come before here and specifically lay out what their negotiating position is. Can I ask him a very simple question? When he says that there was a simple question on the ballot paper about whether we should leave or not leave the European Union, would he tell us what is the simple definition of leaving the European Union? Is it the non-application of European law?
No, there are very different models for leaving, and we've got to be clear what's actually happening here, because it is important when we come to the point about treaties, because we are leaving one treaty and almost certainly signing new treaties. So it's not just about exiting one treaty. I haven't yet met anybody who suggests there should be no relationship between the UK and the EU. And as someone who spent... seriously, as someone who spent 5 years dealing with counter-terrorism and serious criminal offences across Europe, it's inconceivable that we will not be signing new treaties with the EU, because to do otherwise we would undermine our security. I am going to press on because I am conscious that there are very many people who want to come in, and I've sat on the back benches getting irritated by those getting irritated by the front bench taking up all of the time. But this is a matter of parliamentary sovereignty, but it's not just a political point, albeit a very important political point. By proceeding in this closed and secretive manner, the government is causing huge anxiety. In the 2015 Conservative Manifesto, there was a commitment to, quote, safeguard British interest in the single market. Yet in recent weeks, the government has emphasised that membership of the single market may not be a priority for Brexit negotiations. On Monday, the Secretary of State said it was, quote, not necessary for the UK to remain a member of the single market. And then there was a telling exchange between him and the Honourable Member for Ilford North, when the words of the Foreign Secretary were put to him in relation to EU citizens. And the Secretary of State answered, and I've got the full answer because I was struck by it at the time. He said, the simple answer is that we will seek to get the most open, barrier-free market that we can. That will be as good as a single market. Wow. Now, it's always hard to know when the Secretary of State is busking, but But if that is the position, that is a significant statement and a significant position, and it aligns with the approach apparently taken by the Prime Minister, who increasingly appears to have extrapolated from the Leave vote that there's an overwhelming case for a hard Brexit that does not prioritise the jobs or the strength of our economy. I will give way.
Appreciate the Honourable Gentleman giving way. I would like to reassure him and also congratulate him on taking a very factual tone for this very important debate, that there are many of us on the government benches who will do all we can to preserve the benefits of access to the single market for our local businesses. But may I also remind him that the party behind him, 7 out of 10 of his members, represent constituencies that voted to leave the EU. And I think the pragmatic rather than the procedural approach is to read the government's amendment that suggests it would be negotiating madness for this House to have a blow-by-blow scrutiny of the terms of exit. Why doesn't he vote to support the government's amendment, which actually achieves what we all want to achieve, which is not a hard or a soft Brexit, but a smart Brexit?
I am grateful for that intervention and for the indications about the single market. And I know there is a lot of shared concern across the House about the terms of exit. I've obviously looked at the amendment, and can I make it plain that nothing in the motion is intended to undermine or frustrate the vote on the 23rd of June. Nor is it intended to frustrate the negotiations. We all understand the negotiations have to take place. There will have to be a degree of confidentiality, of course, but that does not prevent the plans, the basic outline, the broad terms being put before the House. Now, that's why at the moment I'm waiting to see what the Secretary of State says. I heard the Prime Minister at the tail end of Prime Minister's questions, and she indicated that we'd had 2 statements from the Secretary of State. There was a select committee. I said 2 statements. 2 statements from the Secretary of State. Yeah, that's what I thought I said. Oh, no, 2 statements from the Secretary of State, a select committee, probably 2 select, whatever. If all the amendment means is that we're going to get similar statements to the 2 we've already had, then it doesn't give me much comfort. If we're going to get more than that, then we shall see. But let me move on. I will give way.
Extremely grateful to him for giving way and for some of the points he's made during the debate. But will he use this opportunity to outline clearly the Labour Party's position on single market membership? Because yesterday in the Evening Standard we had the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan's warning against irresponsible hard Brexit, and the departure from single market would be deeply irresponsible. I agree fully with what he's saying. 2 weeks ago in the National Assembly for Wales we had the Labour government voting with the Tories and UKIP against single market membership. What is the Labour Party's policy on single market membership?
Best access to the single market. I was on uncertainty. There has been understandable uncertainty in business, universities, trade unions and investors, including people on both sides of the referendum divide. The head of the CPI has warned that hard Brexit would close the door to an open economy, and an open letter signed by business leaders cautioned last week that leaving the EU without any preferential trade deal and defaulting to trading by WTO's rules would have a significant cost for British exports and importers. And these are just the institutions. So far, the government has made broad statements concerning the principle of protecting the rights of EU citizens already living here. In his statement to the House on Monday, the Secretary of State suggested that the government is doing everything possible to underwrite and guarantee the position of EU citizens resident in the UK, at the same time as seeking to do the same with British nationals living in other parts of the EU. But that constructive tone is at odds with statements made by other government ministers, most notably the Secretary of State for International Trade, who, speaking at an event at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham last week, told Conservative Party members that while, and I quote, "we would like to be able to give a reassurance to EU nationals in the United Kingdom, but that depends on the way they deal with other countries. To give them away before we get into negotiation would be to hand over one of our main cards." treating EU citizens as bargaining chips. That is not good enough, and many EU citizens who've been in the UK for many years and decades deserve better treatment than this. We believe that the government should end this uncertainty in the market and among the people and set out its plans before the House at the earliest opportunity. We accept that concern about immigration and freedom of movement were an important issue in the referendum, and that in light of the result, adjustments to the freedom of movement principle have to be part of a negotiated process. We must establish fair migration rules as part of our new relationship with the EU. But nobody voted on the 23rd of June to take an axe to the economy or to destroy jobs and livelihoods. I will.
Thank you. A clear majority of Ashfield voted out, and I respect that. Ashfield is an ex-mining community. The good economic times were never felt as good up there. The bad times were. We don't have enough good jobs as it is, and isn't it imperative that we don't lose the good jobs that we do have?
I couldn't agree more, and I'm grateful for that intervention. Concern over freedom. No, I really don't think I can be criticised for not taking enough interventions. Concerns over freedom of movement must be balanced by concerns over jobs, trade and the strength of our economy. Striking this balance and navigating our exit from the EU will not be an easy process, and it will require shrewd negotiation. But the government must not give up on the best possible deal for Britain before it has even started. And the government must put the national interest first and not bow to pressure from backbenchers for hard Brexit. This means prioritising access to the single market, protecting workers' rights, ensuring that common police and security measures are not weakened, and ensuring all sectors of our economy are able to trade with our most important market. It also means bringing the British people together as we set about leaving the EU. And I touched on the tone of discussions on Monday, and I think many people have been appalled at some of the language that has been used in relation to exiting the EU. An essential step in that process is to publish the basic plans for Brexit and to seek the confidence of the House of Commons. And this motion is intended to ensure that scrutiny and that accountability. And I will listen, of course, to what the Secretary of State says in relation to his amendment, and I'll give way to him at this point.
Just a point of information. Is his motion requiring a guarantee of a vote? I'm not quite sure. A prior vote. Is that what he's after?
No. The motion before the House is clear as to scrutiny, so it's the first part. There is a question of a vote, and I will make it absolutely clear that I'm pressing for a vote. But this exercise will obviously be going on for some time. We're going to have plenty of these skirmishes. But I am anxious. I'm anxious that we have first proper scrutiny and also a vote. But what I don't want to do is to jeopardise the scrutiny by a vote against the vote. So anybody in this House on all sides who wants scrutiny can happily support the motion. And I will listen carefully to what the Secretary of State says when he speaks about the amendment. But this is a serious challenge. These are the most important decisions for a generation, and the role of this House is a fundamentally important issue that we have to ensure is compatible with scrutiny and accountability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, I call the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, Secretary David Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Another day, another outing. I knew they'd like that.
For the avoidance of doubt, just to be absolutely clear for the benefit of all members, the Secretary of State moves the amendment. The right honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to hear that the Labour Party spokesman is accepting that we must respect the decision of the people. I think that is important progress. It's not, of course, comes from somewhere over there. That's not been at all clear. And I'll come back to why it's not clear in less than a minute, because he also went on to say we didn't want to see point scoring. And I rather agree with that. This is rather too important an issue for point scoring. But the House should know that this morning I received a letter from signed by the Shadow Secretary of State and his predecessor. It was extremely flattering about my history of standing up for the rights of Parliament and so on. It then went on to pose 170 questions about our negotiating strategy. 170. And to give you an idea of how much of a stunt this was, that's one question per day from now until the triggering of Article 50. You know? And worse than that, and worse than that, some of the questions in this very long list, some of them are requests to preemptively concede elements of our negotiating strategy. Preemptively concede. I give way to the Honourable Friend.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State giving way. The Shadow Secretary of State wouldn't give way. So I can now ask my question. I've been listening very carefully. To this debate, and the Shadow Secretary of State talks about respecting the vote on the 23rd of June, and the vote was clear that we are to leave the European Union. Now, you cannot leave the European Union without triggering Article 50, and that's when the negotiations start, and therefore the details that he wants to scrutinise begin. So therefore, shouldn't it be the government's right to trigger Article 50 as the instruction of the British people to go ahead, and then we begin the negotiation?
Well, my honourable friend is exactly right, and that is the premise upon which we are advancing, which is in one second, and that is the premise upon which we're advancing. That is not to say, if he waits for a moment, I'll give way to it. The premise on which we're advancing is that we will have proper scrutiny, and I'll go through that in a minute. But it is not one which we will allow anybody to veto the decision of the British people. That's the point. And I'll now give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, but if it is really the case that Article 50 is the start of the process and we can start being scrutinised after that, why is it that Article 50 is only going to be triggered 9 months after we've had the vote? Surely it's because there's a huge amount of preparation work that needs to go into it, and that's what we want to scrutinise.
It's because it takes a little while to prepare the negotiating strategy, a point I'll come back to again in a second. Now then, I will give way to my old friend.
Can the Secretary of State address this? If there isn't parliamentary assent for the negotiating position that he takes into the negotiations, how could there possibly be parliamentary assent for the result of the negotiations, unless he pulls off the remarkable trick of getting a better deal than he's asking for?
I will go through the stages of assent at some point in this speech, so I'll come back to his points. It is a reasonable point. I'm determined myself that one more time, and then I must make some.
As a long-standing Brexiteer not wishing to make points, might I take him back to the reasons why the government wants to so early action Section 50? What is behind that? And is there any possibility that that statement might take on the colour of the statement from the Home Secretary about foreign workers?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he asked the question with some seriousness. I don't think so. Part of the reasoning here is that the Prime Minister quite reasonably feels that the people want this process to be underway. Indeed, if you believe opinion polls, it's what goes on. But we don't do it immediately, unlike the leader of his party, who said on the 24th of June we should trigger it immediately. And now, of course, he changed his mind. So what we are doing is putting together our negotiating strategy. It requires an enormous amount of work, as I'll come back to in a moment, and some of that will become public as we go along. Now, I'm determined, as would you be expected, that Parliament will be fully and properly engaged in the discussion of how we make a success of Brexit. So turning to the motion set out for this Opposition Day debate, a motion that I can broadly welcome, but with important caveats. The caveats are why the government amendment is necessary. So we can make sure that the decision of the people made on June 23rd is fully respected. That's the first key point. We need to be explicit that while we commend and welcome parliamentary scrutiny. It must not be used as a vehicle to undermine the government's negotiating position or thwart the process of exit. Both things are important. Now, the negotiation will be complex and difficult, and we should do nothing to jeopardise it. As I said on Monday, the honourable gentleman quoted me several times, as I said on Monday in my statement, the sovereignty of Parliament and its restoration is at the very heart of why the UK is withdrawing from the European Union. Not for a moment. For decades, the primacy of the UK Parliament has been superseded by decisions made within European Union institutions, but now, following the clear instruction of the voters on the referendum of June 23rd, we can finally change that and put Parliament unequivocally in charge. Now, that's exactly why we announced plans for the Great Repeal Bill last week. It's a clear commitment to end the primacy of EU law. It will return sovereignty to the institutions of the United Kingdom, because that's what the referendum was about taking back control. Now, naturally, Parliament will oversee the passage of that bill, which will allow us to ensure our statute book is fit for purpose on the day we leave the European Union. Then it will be for Parliament alone to determine what changes to the law best suit the national interest. Let me address that notion and explain what the government's going to do to address each part of it. But before I do, the honourable gentleman there, I think, was first.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I've long heard his support of the scrutiny of Parliament. Will he therefore present to Parliament and have a vote in Parliament on the opening position of the government on the terms which it is presenting for negotiation to the European Union?
I'll come back to some of that later, but what I'm not going to allow is any party to have a veto on the decision to leave the European Union. That is the first key decision. And I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I do find this argument that somehow Parliament wishes to thwart the will of the people a complete straw man, as has already been pointed out. 7 out of 10 Labour MPs are in constituencies where a majority of people voted to leave. I, as a Democrat, cannot ignore that, and I accept the result. Therefore, why is the right honourable gentleman running scared of parliamentary scrutiny?
Well, hardly running scared of parliamentary scrutiny, as was already said. 2 statements, this outing, two appearances before select committees in about 2.5 weeks of parliamentary session. Now, leaving the European Union is a momentous decision. Let's go back to the honourable gentleman's comment. Leaving the European Union is a momentous decision. Let's be clear we agree on that. And with such a huge turnout, 72%, with over 33 million people having their say, there's an overwhelming mandate to put the will of the British people into practice. Now, I've spoken at length about our plan to make a success of Brexit, and as I set out in my statement of the 5th of September, again, which I think was quoted by the honourable gentleman, first we want to build a national consensus around our position. I've already promised more than once to listen to all sides of the debate and make sure we fight our negotiation for the best deal in the country. You can't really do that in an era of secrecy, but I'll come back to that too. Second, we'll put the national interest first and listen carefully to what the devolved administrations say to us. My third aim is, wherever possible, and it's not always possible, but wherever possible, we will minimise uncertainty. That's part of what the Great Repeal Bill is about, bringing existing EU law into domestic law upon exit day and empowering Parliament to make the changes necessary to reflect our new relationship. And finally, by the end of this process, when we have left the European Union, we'll have put sovereignty and supremacy of Parliament beyond doubt. I give way to the honourable lady.
I greatly appreciate him giving way. I think the issue fundamentally is, although we all want scrutiny, of course, the eyes of the world and the eyes of the financial markets are also upon us. And I am extremely concerned by what has happened to sterling and what has happened to interest rates since the Prime Minister's comments at the conference last week. And I think the problem the Secretary of State is not acknowledging is that many people in the country don't think that there is a policy to put the national interest first. They think there is a policy to put people's narrow ideological interests first. And what he should be setting out is quite clearly how we are going to protect British jobs and businesses and put ideology in the past where it belongs.
Well, I hardly think it's ideology. I hardly think it's ideology to to reflect the will of the British people. That's hard ideology. I give way.
I'm very grateful for Secretary for giving way a second time. Would he agree with the Italian Prime Minister Renzi, when he said that we have to make Brexit work for the EU and for the United Kingdom, because if we don't, then it would make a mockery of democracy? That is not ideology.
Well, he's right. And of course, nobody in this exercise from the other side of the argument has ever pointed out quite how odd it is that fellow democracies, allies indeed, threaten to punish each other for the exercise of democratic rights. Now, the point. No, for a moment I won't, because I want to take up the honourable lady, my honourable friend's point, because there is a big task ahead of us. There's no doubt about that. People naturally want to understand where we're headed. That's pretty obvious, and we have been pretty clear on the overarching aims, not the detailed aims. We're not even at the point that that's possible. The overarching aims are these: bringing back control of laws to Parliament, bringing back control of decision over immigration to the UK, maintaining the strong security cooperation that we have with the EU, and establishing the freest possible market in goods and services with the European Union and the rest of the world. I cannot see how those are not very clear, overarching strategic objectives. The Honourable Gentleman wants to give way.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Can I just say that it would be helpful to businesses to give as much clarity as possible over the likely future trading arrangements. I was concerned to see VTB Bank announce yesterday an intention to locate activities outside of the UK. So I would just say to the Secretary of State, the more clarity we can give without, of course, prejudicing our negotiating position, the better it will be for British businesses, because there is a danger some may make decisions in the next 2 or 3 or 4 months.
And I take his point, and the issue that one has to bear in mind, however, is that we can give clarity as we go along about the negotiating strategy in grand terms, not in detailed terms. But what we can't do is tell anybody, business or others, where we will arrive at the final stage, because it's a negotiation, and that we have to face facts to. In a moment, it is a negotiation, and a negotiation is therefore is not entirely within the control of one country. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The honourable member for Camborne and Redruth has just said on the politics show at lunchtime that it is likely that the government will publish a green paper or a white paper with its proposals to form the basis of consultation before the triggering of Article 50.
That's nice to know.
Now,
Did you know?
Is this the latest handbrake U-turn? What has the Minister got to say?
He was busking as well.
No is the answer, and by the way, a half U-turn is a right turn, I think. Now, one of the reasons I took the intervention from him is to say this. One of the things we have sought to clarify early, which does not have a cost to it in negotiating terms, is the treatment of employment rights for workers, and that we made very clear very soon, just as I tried to do with the status of EU migrants here. We can do those things early. We cannot, as he well knows, he's negotiated any number of deals in his time. He well knows you cannot give away all your negotiating strategy early. In a moment. Now, it may be... no, not for the moment. Let me just finish this section, and then I'll give way to one of my colleagues in a moment. Now, look, we've got these fairly obvious overarching strategic aims. They're very clear. They're not remotely doubtful, and my only view on it must be that Labour don't want to recognise it because some of them are uncomfortable for them. I mean, they have a policy which is, I'm not quite sure entirely what it is, about European immigration. It is completely unspecified on European immigration. And so yes, I will go.
Are we going to get more than those 4 short sentences? Are we going to get a plan? That's a simple question.
Well, he can wait till the later part of my speech when I give him exactly that answer. But you have to wait for that. Now, at the moment, we've got the reason this is not being promised before the end of March is because it takes time. As he will understand, it will take time. We're meeting organisations across the country, from creative industry, telecoms, financial services, agriculture, energy, in a moment, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, Universities UK, TUC. All these organisations are putting to us their concerns. And some of them are incredibly serious concerns, which we have to deal with. And we're focusing on dealing with those concerns, establishing what opportunities there are, because there are quite significant opportunities too, and then devising a negotiating strategy that serves the interest of the whole country, all of them, not one of them at a time. I give way to him now.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. My constituency has the third highest financial sector employment anywhere of any constituency in the UK. Does he share my concern that whilst employees in that sector do not hear the detail of the government's position on negotiations, they do hear, as we've just heard from his backbenchers, from those employers who are looking over time to move out of this country?
Well, I'm afraid in the immediate aftermath of the vote to leave, there was an extraordinary outpouring almost of grief, but a blame Brexit festival, if you like. And we saw it ranging from the Italian finance minister who blamed us for the state of his bond markets, more significantly to banks in this country, saying they're laying people off because of Brexit, which of course it turned out to be entirely untrue. Entirely untrue. So yeah, I would have some sympathy with employees who are made nervous by employers who are guessing the worst outcome. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Secretary of State. I would urge him to take a more constructive approach with those who have very sincere anxieties about the future. In the North East, 58% of our exports go to EU countries, regardless of how anyone voted in this referendum. They did not vote to lose those jobs. Therefore, the terms of exit are absolutely essential. Does the Secretary of State not recognise that parliamentary scrutiny is therefore essential? Here.
Well, I started by saying I'm in favour of parliamentary scrutiny. I'll widen that out later. And part of the reason for it, it's not the only reason by any means, but part of the reason for it is a recognition of concerns of people about their own job futures. No doubt about that. That's why we've said in terms we want to get a free trade arrangement which is at least as good as what we have now, both in terms of the European Union but also outside. I give way to the Honourable Lady there.
I'm very grateful. Could I tempt him to just put some flesh on some bones on, say, immigration? Has the government arrived at the decision to, A, give EU citizens who are currently here the rights they had on the 23rd of June? Have we agreed that we will break the automaticity between trade and people? Have we agreed that EU citizens should have the same conditions for immigration as non-EU citizens? There must be some very broad principles which he could already share with the House now.
Well, let me deal with the first issue she raised, the treatment of current EU migrants, which she's raised and made an issue of. And I have said in terms, and again it was quoted by the Honourable Gentleman, that we seek to give them guarantees as good as what they have now. The only condition is that we get the same guarantees for British citizens. And far from making people bargaining chips, treating them as a group, treating them collectively, avoids making them bargaining chips. Now, in terms of other aspects of the immigration policy, my task in this essentially is to bring the control back to the UK. It is not to decide what the eventual immigration policy will be, but it must be decidable here, decidable in this House by a British government and subject to parliamentary oversight and control. So I will, that's where we go. I'll make some progress and I'll give way again in a moment. She's next. Now, to return to the opposition's motion, in a moment, they say that there should be a full and transparent debate on the government's plan for leaving the EU. I agree. And at the same time, I'm sure we'll also all agree that nothing should be done to compromise the national interest in the negotiation to come. I actually think the Honourable Gentleman said that in his opening speech. Now, I can go through and list the whole series, the 100 questions we've answered, the oral statements, the appearances in front, and the House knows all this. The House knows all this. We are not, as a department, being in a moment. We're not, as a department, being backward in appearing in front of the House. The House may not be overwhelmed with the detail of the answers yet. Hardly surprising. We're only a few weeks into the process. We are 6 months away from the end of the process, so that doesn't surprise me. But the simple truth is that we are appearing regularly in front of the House and seeking to give as much as we can. I give way to the Honourable Lady for Brighton.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. He said a moment ago that the Great Repeal Bill will give us some certainty. So can I ask him for some certainty on environmental legislation in particular? Because even when EU environmental legislation has been enshrined in UK law, what we need to know is, first, the extent to which any future changes to environmental safeguards will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny and vote. And second, what kind of accountability mechanisms he's imagining to be in place, because once we're out of the EU, we lose access to the ECJ, we lose access to the Commission. How does that environmental legislation become judiciable?
It's not so much, it's judiciable, but it's also subject to amendment in this House. It will be entirely subject to the will of the House. Any government seeking to alter it will have to get the permission of the House. They'll get a vote through the House. So it's very, very plain. It will also be under British courts. I mean, that's the other aspect of it, which is which I think she asked about. Now, no, but to be fair, I did promise the Honourable Lady. There we are.
Right. Following up on the question from my right honourable friend, the member for Edgbaston, I seek a bone. Could the right honourable gentleman, my right honourable friend, please tell us now, has the government turned its back on membership of the single market? Yes or no, please?
This is. I'm afraid that intervention is really rather a demonstration of one of the problems we have with the language over this. We've had people talking about hard Brexit and soft Brexit, which means very little. We have had an attempt to sort of try and pigeonhole what could be any one of a whole range of outcomes in market terms. We have not started the negotiation with the European Union yet, not started the European Union negotiation yet, and there is a whole spectrum from a free trade area to customs union to the single market arrangement. Now, and the honourable gentleman, the spokesman for the opposition, was laying out some of them. Now, we're not going to go for a Norwegian option. We're not going to go for a Turkish option. We're not going to go for a Swiss option. We're going to go for a British option, and that will be tailored to our interest and will be better for our interest than any other option offered. Now, the honourable gentleman from Manchester was, sure.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, but his non-answer to the very reasonable question from his honourable friend illustrates the point. The reason he's struggling today can be found in the words of Sir Andrew Khan, who said this in September: "I find it shocking that David Cameron, as Prime Minister, prohibited the civil service from doing preparatory work. I think it was a humiliation for this country that our partners in Europe should say, you voted for this, but you have no idea what you want." Can the right honourable gentleman give any plausible explanation for this serious dereliction of duty by the former Prime Minister?
There are very many things I'm going to do at the dispatch box, but criticising David Cameron is not one of them. Now,
will my right honourable friend give way? On this point.
in a moment.
On this point, will my right honourable friend give way on this point?
No, in a moment. Oh, all right, I'll give way.
I'm most grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I nail this lie once and for all? The Public Administration and Constitutional Select Committee took evidence from Sir Jeremy Haywood the other day, and he confirmed that senior civil servants were meeting before the referendum to discuss the outcomes, including the possibility that the country would vote to leave the European Union. So plans and preparations were being made by the British civil service before the referendum.
They were passing notes to each other saying, "Oh,
I will not for the moment. I'll move on now to the actual question of scrutiny itself. We have already got plans the House, not the government, has got plans to put in place the so-called Brexit Select Committee, which will take effect next month, and we will be appearing in front of that regularly. It would be rather surprising to appear in front of that Select Committee and not be talking about some of our plans. I expect to attend the committee regularly, just as I will also attend the Lords Committee, its effective equivalent. So we don't shy from scrutiny, we welcome it, but members of this House will know I have continually and welcomed and championed the extension of Select Committee powers since the publication of the Right Committee report in 2009. And the public expects ministers to engage with Parliament in this way, and we will continue to do so. In a moment. I also made commitment in September that this Parliament will be at least as informed of progress in our negotiations as the European Union Parliament. Now, the honourable gentleman didn't appear to believe that when I told the Lords, but it was also confirmed in the Select Committee in this House too, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, to make it very plain. And we are setting up administrative procedures for when it becomes relevant, which will be a month or two, as to make sure that happens. It happens quickly. In other words, we're not having to go to an EU website to find what we want to know. So that will be the minimum. That will be the minimum. Understand that. And we're going to be considerably beyond the minimum. And I have, in a moment, very Scott Nat way of getting attention. Now, I should also tell the House that, as I say, I made the commitment that the Parliament be kept as informed, at least as informed, and more informed, better informed than the EU Parliament. I've also asked the Chief Whip to, through usual channels, ensure that we have a series of debates so the House can air its views. And it would be, again, very surprising if we had those debates without presenting to the House something for them to debate. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I refer back to the honourable member for Broxtow's earlier question. I don't think the Secretary of State actually answered adequately enough. You're either a member of the single market or you're not. So I think it's clear now the government needs to spell out, are you in favour of being members of the single market or are you not? Inform the House.
Yeah. It's astonishing how linear or black and white they think this is. You've got Norway, which is inside the single market and outside the customs union. You've got Turkey, which is inside the customs union, outside the single market. You've got Switzerland, which is not in the single market but has equivalent access to all of its for all of its productive and manufacturing services. So this is not a single entity. It is a spectrum of outcomes, and we will be seeking to get the best of the spectrum of outcomes. I give way to the honourable lady.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He will know that right throughout the country, when this was being discussed, the British public voted. They knew that being a member of the single market meant that you had to have free movement.
No,
this was one of the of labour. This was one of the basic principles of why people in their millions voted to leave. Is it not time that we were actually straightforwardly saying that we want to have access and the fullest possible access to the single market, but that we cannot, if we are going to stop free movement, which is what the people of this country wanted, then we cannot be members of the single market.
Broadly, the argument about full access and control of our own borders is an argument that the Prime Minister has already made in the last few weeks. So I don't think I need to elaborate on that. But let's understand something about this. I mean, where does this argument? Sometimes we seem to be arguing over which end of the egg we open first. The argument between us is where the dividing line is on what we tell Parliament about. The honourable gentleman recognised in terms, I think, that we could not give every detail to Parliament. We could not give it, despite his letter, we could not give a blow-by-blow. We could not have Parliament dictate how we dealt with the trade-offs and the terms and so on. So it's fairly plain that that's what the criterion is, despite the noise to his right. That's where the problem is. Now, let's be clear how this applies. If you tell your negotiator, your opposite number in negotiation, exactly what your priorities are, exactly what your top priority is, then it will make that top priority extremely expensive.
Right.
Ordinary people in their ordinary lives probably do one big transaction themselves, and that's the purchase of a house. If you went to buy a house and you only looked at one house, you told the person you were in love with their house, and you made a bid for it, I suspect the price would go up. And that, in a moment, I suspect, I've got a lady over here to take it a second, the price will go up. Similarly, if you make, in a moment, if you make preemptive indications that you are willing to make a concession on something, you actually reduce the value of that concession. So in many, many ways, we cannot give details about how we are going to run a negotiation. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and he's right that negotiations are a fragile process. But I welcome his support for scrutiny. My select committee, the Women and Equality Select Committee, is looking very closely at the impact of Brexit on equality protections, something which I'm sure is not necessarily high on his list at the moment within his group. We want to do some of that work with him. Will we undertake today to work with us on that and contribute to our Select Committee inquiry? Because at the moment we're finding it difficult to secure that contribution from his department.
Well, I see no reason not to help the Select Committee on that basis. That seems to me an eminently sensible use of time and use of the Select Committee's expertise. So of course we'll do that. But this is going to be an issue right across the board. Pretty much every Select Committee in the House of Commons is going to have an interest, one way or another, in the progress of Brexit and what the outcome will be. I will allow him now.
Grateful, Tim. Can I just ask him about timing? Because as I understand it, the government intends us to have left the European Union by the 1st of April 2019. The 2 years allowed for in Article 50 will transpire during that period. But he's already laid out loads of different areas which will have to be legislated for as a result of those negotiations, after those negotiations have happened, when he might be overturned in this House or at the other end of the building. How is he going to make sure that he carries the whole of the country with him, with each of the bits and pieces of the detail, if he hasn't produced a draft of what he's aiming for in the first place?
That's why we made plain at the beginning of this process that we were going to have the Great Repeal Bill, which will actually put into UK law, or domestic law more accurately, will put into domestic law what is currently the acquis communautaire. That's the start position. Then it comes down to the House to amend that under the guidance of the individual departments. So there may be, for example, a fisheries bill. There may be some other legislation of that sort of nature. And that will have to be argued through at the time. It's pretty straightforward. Forgive me, but I'll give way in a second. I did actually promise him next. Yes.
Thank you to the Secretary of State. He said a moment ago that it would be a mistake for the government to illustrate what its top priority in the negotiations is. But isn't it the case that every speech at the Conservative Party conference indicated that the top priority was the control and limitation of immigration from within the European Union? Is that not the case?
That, frankly, will be within our own control. If you leave the European Union, that gives you control over that. The access back into the European Union, and how you're not into it, but how you deal with it, how you trade with it, then comes on from there. So it's not an issue which actually meets that. Now, in a second. The simple demonstration of what I'm trying to, the point I'm making, is this. In Northern Ireland, where we have a really important issue to resolve, soft borders, right? There is a circumstance where both sides of the decision-making position the decision makers have this similar interest: the Northern Irish Executive, and the Irish government. And as a result, we can be very open about that. And we have indeed been very open about that. And indeed, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was actually quoted in The Guardian on Monday in detail about what he's trying to achieve in terms of customs arrangements, cross-border arrangements, the common travel area, all of these things, very, very straightforward, laid out in some detail. Why? Because that doesn't give away any of our negotiating cards, because it's between two people with the same aim. So that is a much better example of how we have to be careful about what we say as we go into the negotiation. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He mentioned fisheries and taking back control. So is fisheries perhaps an area that might be devolved to the Scottish Parliament after the United Kingdom leaves the European Union? And can he, unlike the Secretary of State for Scotland seemed to be able to do earlier today, rule out that any power will be repatriated from the Scottish Parliament to this place as part of the Brexit process?
Well, I wouldn't expect that's part of the Brexit process at all. But it's one of the things we will, to take the serious point, we need to discuss with the devolved administrations, all of them, how we address issues like fisheries, farming, hill farming, all sorts of issues which will alter and which the legal basis will alter as we bring things back to the United Kingdom. Yep.
The position of the status quo in that, as the Secretary of State well knows, that everything is devolved to Scotland unless it's reserved. Agriculture and fisheries are not reserved, therefore they're devolved. So unless the government intends to change that position, it'll be automatic that agriculture and fisheries powers will go to the Scottish government.
This is an area where we have not addressed or talked to the devolved assembly at all, the devolved administration at all yet. We will do so before we get to the position, before we get to bringing it back. Now, this is not just the attitude on negotiating data is not simply the government. The Lords European Union Committee concluded the following. It's clear that parliamentary scrutiny of the negotiations will have to strike a balance between, on the one hand, the desire for transparency, and on the other, the need to avoid undermining the UK's negotiating position. So this is hardly rocket science in that sense. It should hardly be controversial. It should be straightforward. So at every stage of this process, I want this House to be engaged and updated. And as I have made clear, we'll observe the constitutional and legal conventions that apply to any new treaty any new treaty on a new relationship with the European Union. To address the final part of the motion, the House is able to properly scrutinise government plans for leaving the EU before Article 50 is invoked. Article 50 sets out the process by which we leave the EU. That has been decided by the British people. Invoking it is a job for government. Leaving the EU is what the British people voted for on the 23rd of June, and Article 50 is how we do it.
Will my right to Frank give way on that point?
Yes,
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I welcome the terms of the government's amendment to the motion, which seems entirely sensible. Will he therefore accept, and is my understanding right that he now does accept, that those of us who are raising concerns about the level of debate that is necessary ahead of the triggering of Article 50 are by no means necessarily seeking to frustrate the will of the people, have accepted the instruction from the British people that we should leave the European Union? Rather, however, what we seek is a full understanding of what the government's broad negotiating aims are.
Well, I'm glad to hear him say that. I mean, scrutiny of our strategic aims are what debates like this are about, in truth. And parliamentary engagement of the kind I've mentioned, debating those issues that inform our negotiating position to holding the government to account. But they have to be at a strategic level. They cannot be tactical. They cannot enter into the individual detail of the negotiation. I give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Isn't this one of the strange debates where both sides are actually agreeing with each other that we are going to have parliamentary scrutiny? And if the opposition are against it, they can do opposition days, there can be backbench business questions, there'll be urgent statements, there can be Westminster Hall. All these things are the power of Parliament. We are absolutely not disagreeing today. We're all going to, at the end, accept the motion. What's going on is there's a general lot of noise, but actually Parliament is agreeing that this process should go forward and we will scrutinise it properly. Does the Secretary of State think that that's the gist?
Well, to be frank, I do. I think we've been going around in circles debating whether or not we're going to debate. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman giving way. He mentioned a few moments ago hill farmers and the agricultural sector and also the fishery sector. I happen to be a crofter myself, and many other crofters will be wondering and asking, will the financial support remain for hill sheep farmers for the rest post-Brexit? Indeed, fishermen will be asking the same of assistance for purchasing and upgrading fishing boats. So on those two things, on that money, are we going to make sure that money that comes from Europe will be replaced by the UK government?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman will know that we've already made undertakings to the 2020 round, which of course is the end of the European guarantee. Beyond that, I am quite sure the Treasury will be looking very hard at the necessary economics of these industries in all of the devolved administrations, and indeed in England too. So, now, I will not. Let me be clear. The spokesman for the opposition, the Shadow Secretary of State, said that the British people did not vote for any particular model of Brexit. I think that's pretty much what he said. Now, what they voted for was leaving the European Union. That was the word. That was the words on the ballot paper. They would, I think, have presumed, it would be reasonable to think they presume, not about soft Brexit or hard Brexit or any other sort of specification of Brexit. They will have assumed that the British government would have set about a negotiation to do the best possible for all parts of society, all parts of the United Kingdom, including all the devolved administrations, all industries, sectors, services, manufacturing, and so on. And the honourable lady sitting next to him goes, yeah, because we know her view of the British working class. She's really had a very good time on that, hasn't she? Yeah? So I take a very much more serious view of the fate of the British working class under the governments that she will support. The simple truth is what the British government is doing is setting out to create the best possible outcome in security terms, in control of our borders terms, in democratic terms, and in terms of the access to markets across the whole world, the European Union, and all of the opportunities we have outside. And the British people did vote for that, 17.5 million of them.
Order. The original question was, as on the order paper, since when Amendment B has been proposed by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. The question is that the amendment be made. Mr. Stephen Gethins.
Mr. Speaker, can I start by welcoming the new spokesperson and the opposition, the member for St Pancras in Holborn. We very much look forward to working with him over these crucial few months. Can I also thank him for bringing this motion to the House today? I think that the Secretary of State displayed to us that he's still got a long way to go to meet a lot of the doubts and the questions that the member raised, but I think his debate and bringing it forward was a step in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, these talks, negotiations, this crucial period will have an impact across every policy area in every part of the country. But we're seeing very little in the way of detail. Mr. Speaker, I fear that this lack of detail that we're getting has got more to do with a cabinet who can't agree amongst themselves than it does to do with any ideas of a negotiating strategy. I'm a new Member of Parliament, but maybe other members can tell me, is it normal that a Secretary of State who, and we welcome, spends so much time at the dispatch box without actually telling us anything? He spent a lot of time there, and I'm none the wiser about where we are at the moment. It seems remarkable. And the other thing about negotiations, I'm wondering if they can tell us, is they tell us that they're having negotiations. The member for Airdrie and Shotts brought up the question of the single market, as did others, brought up these key questions, and they can't answer a simple question. And that strikes me. When you do sit down with our European partners and you do start your negotiations, what are you saying to them? What could you possibly be telling them? We don't even have a starting point. And Mr. Speaker, if I can make, and I'd just like to make this point. I'd like to make this point, because he made this point to my honourable friend, the member for Airdrie and Shotts. He talked about, well, this is like buying a house. Secretary of State, this is not like buying a house. This is a democratic process that will impact on our citizens to a significant degree and which should be subject to the most intense scrutiny of this place and the most intense scrutiny of devolved administrations as well. And on that point, I'll wait for the honourable gentleman.
And I know that the member and his party resist the will of the people as expressed across the United Kingdom in this referendum. But what does he find difficult about the Secretary of State's assurance that as far as the government is concerned, they are seeking, when it comes to trade, to just take the single market issue, they're seeking to ensure the maximum exposure to the European market for British manufacturers and service industries, and that will be the aim of the negotiations. What's so difficult about that?
On that point, actually, one of the reasons that so many of his own constituents, in fact 57% of the people of Northern Ireland, voted to remain Parliament were for many reasons, one of which was the act of irresponsibility that was campaigning to leave the European Union. That's you, Secretary of State, or sorry, that was the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, along with others, who campaigned to leave the European Union based on a blank sheet of paper. And I've said this before in this House, and I'll say it again. When we campaigned for independence, we had the decency to produce, and the Honourable Member for Right Honourable Member Gordon had the decency to produce a 670-page white paper. People knew what they were voting for, and it wasn't the kind of mess that we're seeing today. I don't know, I'll give it.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I'm sure the farmers and the fishermen of Northern Ireland will be as worried and concerned as the crofters and fishermen of the Outer Hebrides when they know there are no guarantees to their funding post-2020. That's a real case of material concern for people in all parts.
The honourable friend raises a very good point. It is a significant cause of concern for fishermen, farmers. I'll make some progress here. Fishermen, farmers, universities and others who rely on our relationship with the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we were dealing with the Vote Leave campaign with an act of negligence from this government in providing us with no details, building on an act of gross irresponsibility that came from the Vote Leave campaign. And if you can answer for that act of gross irresponsibility, I'll give way to the honourable member.
Very grateful. As I recall, he's mentioned the fact that his party produced a 600-page dossier ahead of the vote. Absolutely. But when asked which currency they would use in an independent, they had no idea. They simply had no idea and had no clue about the consequences of independence.
As remarkable. The Right Honourable Member for Gordon set up a Fiscal Commission working group to look into it, involving a whole range of arguments. I'm sure we can make it aware to the member. We had all the details. Two Nobel laureates on that. How many Nobel laureates? How many? Zero.
Order. Mr. McNeill. You are an exceptionally boisterous fellow, and in the course of your boisterous behaviour, you appear to be chewing some sort of gum. A very eccentric contact. I mean, I have great aspirations for you to be a statesman, but I think your apprenticeship still has some distance to travel. Mr. Stephen Gethins.
Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, just to round off where I talk about something, if you'll forgive me mixing my cultural references, the three Brexiteers and their friends have got us into another fine mess that they can't tell us how they're going to get us out of it. And on the point, and I'll come to the honourable member in just a moment, on the point of the devolved administrations, and it's a very significant point, the Right Honourable Member for Gordon raised the point. It was a point that wasn't answered. In fact, like most points that were raised with the Secretary of State, it wasn't answered. Now, there is not a matter for negotiation in these islands. If you're fishing and you're farming, do they go straight to the Scottish Parliament? Will they go straight there? Are you going to have a change to the Scotland Act? And in particular, are you going to have a change to Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act? And you've got no answers. That's not a matter of negotiation. That's a matter of fact, and it's facts that you cannot give us. This is it's been extraordinarily disappointing in terms of the devolved administrations, where we've gone from being from being involved to consulted. And I'm wondering if the Secretary of State will tell us, as the Prime Minister told us previously, will there be an agreed position with the devolved administrations? I'm wondering if he could tell us that. Maybe somebody else will take a note for him. Will there be an agreed position with the devolved administrations? And what is the formal role of the Scottish Parliament? So I'll tell you this, Mr. Speaker.
this place and the UK government doesn't have a particularly good track record when standing up for fishermen and farmers and others. The member for Orkney and Shetland raised the point, as did the Right Honourable Member for Gordon raised the point, that when we went into the European Union, Scotland's fishermen and fishermen across these islands were described as expendable. And I'll give way to him on that point.
This will give the Secretary of State the opportunity to listen to the Honourable Member's question, but in the days after she became Prime Minister, the Prime Minister met with Scotland's First Minister and then seemed to assure Scotland that Article 50 would not be triggered until there was an agreed position with the Scottish administration. Now, I think it's a very fair point for the Honourable Member to ask, is that still government policy, or has the Prime Minister been countermanded by the Secretary of State for Brexit?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I will allow the Secretary of State maybe give us an answer.
I apologise for having to intervene on him for this answer, but the Prime Minister showed very clearly how important she viewed the devolved administrations in Scotland. She went to Scotland first after her coming to power, as it were, and she said plainly two things. One was we are going to consult and discuss with the Scottish Government, Scottish administration, and Welsh and Northern Irish ones as well, in detail, before we triggered Article 50 and before we brought the Great Repeal Act to the Great Repeal Bill to the House. But what we cannot do is give anybody a veto. We consider ourselves bound by the decision of the British people. So nobody can say, no, you can't do this. We will do everything possible in our power to meet the needs of the Scottish people and indeed the other devolved administrations.
Very good. Mr. Speaker, yet more time at the dispatch box and yet now even less information. What we were told was there would be an agreed position between the devolved administrations. Now, the Secretary of State clearly seems to be backtracking on that. Maybe in due course he can tell us if there will still be an agreed position, but I don't want to get him into trouble yet again, so I'll leave him to chat to the Prime Minister about that. But I'd like to I'm going to make some progress on this, because I'm going to make some progress on this, and there's a valuable point that this place has to learn, is that democracy in the United Kingdom does not begin and end in this Parliament. It hasn't begun and ended in this Parliament for some time. Yet at the moment, we're in a situation whereby the unelected House of Lords along that corridor will have a greater say on what happens next than the devolved administrations. The elected devolved administrations, incidentally, Mr. Speaker. And just to throw out some questions which I know those from devolved administrations will be asking themselves. What happens to the Coastal Communities Fund on which fishing communities depend? What happens to CAP, which has been raised not least by the Honourable Member for Nahilan and Anir? What happens to the renewable obligations where Scotland is streaking ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom along with our climate change obligations? What happens to our world-leading universities? And I have to mention the University of St Andrews and the outstanding work that it's doing in this field. What happens to the environment? The honourable members clearly in need of a better education. What happens to the environment and our air pollution targets? What happens to the social protections? All of these questions that are unanswered, and yet we still don't have the question, or what happens to the single market, and what happens to European nationals? And on that point, I'll give way to the gentleman.
Most grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way as chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. He is raising very legitimate points on the very legitimate basis that democracy does exist in other parts of the United Kingdom, somewhat independently from this House, and therefore we need a respectful and constructive dialogue between the United Kingdom government and the administrations in the other parts of the United Kingdom, and indeed between this Parliament and the other parliaments of the United Kingdom. And I've already visited the Scottish Parliament with my committee to that end, and I'm actually offering to give evidence to the Scottish Parliament on these questions and how we should address them. And I hope the dialogue that he wants will be in that spirit of cooperation.
Can I thank the honourable member for the points he raised? Can I thank him for visiting Edinburgh? And can I encourage him and his colleagues on the committee to interact with their colleagues on the committees in the Scottish Parliament? And actually, I'm glad to be able to say this to him this time. I think he makes a very, very fair point, and I agree with him that that's what should be happening. But there are no, I want to make some progress. There are key questions that need to be made on the single market, and I want to talk about European nationals for a moment. European nationals have made this country their home. They contribute significantly to our social well-being, to our financial well-being. They make our society all the richer for being part of it. And to be described by the International Trade Secretary as cards, and I know the Secretary of State started to, again, ring back from that as well, was utterly unacceptable. And on that point, I'll give way to the Honourable Member who's been trying to get in.
On the point of structural funds that he raises, do you also agree with me that the government can't even be straight on this? Because the Chancellor's letter, which he issued earlier this year, only refers to funds that have been allocated already, not reference to the huge amounts of funding, for example, the North East, is yet to be allocated. So even on that is confusion. And if it's not the full amount, the North East could, I'm sure, like other regions, lose absolutely hundreds of millions of pounds.
Thank the Honourable Member for his point. He makes a very valid one, and this is the point that universities, businesses, so many others, and I think about even cultural organisations. There's a church in my constituency, St Athanase, it's 850 years old, in the town of Lookers. They would be looking next steps for European funding to help keep that dual standing, and they have to think about where they go next without any answers. We need to plan well beyond 2020. The Honourable Member makes an excellent point. And this reminds me, not at the moment, and this reminds me of the Institute for Government, who have said there is a gaping void in government negotiating strategy, as well as their policy in their negotiating strategy. And they're responsible for negotiating on behalf of us all. And that is something that should concern us all. We've not seen any more details. We haven't seen a green paper, for example. I'm not sure if any of the ministers have, but we certainly haven't. But think about the impact that this will have. The Fraser-Valander Institute said in Scotland alone, I know honourable members will have concerns from elsewhere in the United Kingdom as well, there will be 3% fewer jobs by the time we leave the European Union. This could cost 80,000 jobs, with real wages affecting households that could be 7% lower. And we saw the Treasury figures, the government's own figures, warning of a cost of leaving the European Union of 66 billion.
Will my honourable friend...
Professor, and I'll take the lead at this point.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He'll be aware that the financial services sector in Scotland supports 150,000 jobs, many of them in my Edinburgh South West constituency. And he'll also be aware that there's concern in that sector just now about whether passporting rights will be lost or kept as a result of Brexit. Does he agree with me that if the government are not successful in negotiating passporting rights for the financial sector, many jobs are likely to leave Scotland and to go to Europe, the European continent?
And the Honourable Lady makes an excellent point, and one I know which particularly affects her constituency, and she's right to raise it. Yes, I do agree with it. And yes, and on that point, and I won't at the moment, and on that point I want to quote Professor Graham Roy, who said from the Fraser-Valander Institute, said leaving the EU would have a significant negative impact on the Scottish economy, and that rings true for exactly the point that's been raised. And on that point, I'll give way to the gentleman.
Very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He mentioned a moment ago that people wanted certainty beyond 2020. Is he aware that the multi-annual financial framework will not be renewed until 2020, and therefore there is uncertainty even if we remain within the European Union as to how funding will continue after that date, including for the Honourable Gentleman from Nehillingen and Niles Crofters?
Well, I congratulate the Honourable Member on the latter point, on referring to the member for Nehillingen and Nier. But on the point on the 2020, he's of course right. But already we see universities who negotiate with each other well beyond 2020, who make collaborations. Businesses, regions, local authorities who make collaborations well beyond 2020. They have the certainty of membership of the European Union, they have the certainty of membership of the single market, and they have the certainty on the continued benefits from these programmes. So on that point, I don't agree with the Honourable Member, and this is a significant amount of uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, not quite yet. Mr. Speaker, a lot of this debate over the coming little while should be on scrutiny, and we should be able to talk about all of our constituents who are affected by this. But it's also about vision and the kind of country that we want to see beyond if the rest of the United Kingdom leaves. I was proud, and I'm sure every member of this House, of my party, was proud that 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain. No, not at the moment. No, thank you. That 62%, the biggest gap between leave and remain in any part of the United Kingdom. And for me, that talks about a positive vision that's come out. That's a vision, not at the moment, that's a vision of a country that wants to take its place in the world. That's the reason I joined the Scottish National Party, was because I believed in a Scotland that was an equal in this family of nations throughout the European Union. I believed in a Scotland that should cooperate on an equal basis with our partners in the Netherlands, in Norway, in Germany, in France, in England and Wales, in Ireland, and indeed in Northern Ireland as well. Some of our closest friends and partners. I believe that the EU nationals who have made Scotland their home are welcome and should be staying and make a contribution to our... And I am proud to be part of a group that draws members from across the United Kingdom and beyond, because we want to see a country that is outward-looking, cooperating with our European partners. And that is why so many of people in Scotland and elsewhere are turning away from a United Kingdom and a government, a Conservative government, being led by the nose by UKIP, talking about EU nationals as cards, talking about firms drawing up lists of foreigners to put out. That's not something that I subscribe to, and that's not something that I'm sure anybody on these benches subscribes to as well. We want to see more scrutiny, but I fear it'll be insufficient. But I want to hear the Minister answer the questions that I've raised and answer the very valid points that were raised by the opposition spokesperson. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Order. We will begin with a 10-minute limit on backbench speeches, from which a number of honourable and right honourable members will benefit. But I give due notice to the House that that limit will have to be sharply lowered, probably relatively early. Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Well, Mr. Speaker, sadly I wasn't able to attend the Conservative Party conference this year, but I followed its proceedings very closely, or as closely as I could, through the reports in the media. And I was rather surprised to find that some very clear statements of policy on the European subject were made there from the platform, which I was not totally expecting. One of them was that we wouldn't trigger Article 50 before the end of March at the latest, and I think I rather approve of that. This is such a portentous decision that long and careful preparation of a policy within a government which I rather fear probably doesn't yet have an agreed policy is really quite important. And when I say they should take as long as they possible about it isn't meant to be sarcastic. I don't underestimate the sheer scale of the task facing them to agree this strategy. But then the other announcements were made where it was made absolutely clear that freedom of movement of labour with other European Union countries was going to be over, and it conjured up the vision of work permits and so on, and possibly quotas. It was made perfectly clear that the control of all the rules and regulations which currently enable free trade within the single market were going to be taken back into our jurisdiction. No Brexiteer at the moment is able to name any very important rule that they wish to change. But we're taking it back into the British Parliament and then are free to change such rules of the market as Parliament will agree and which it wants to change. And we're also no longer going to submit to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is the way in which the European Union has worked. The reason it's lasted, it still lasts, as a 28-member nation-state organisation with common rules, is there are institutions for enforcing those rules, and indeed Britain has used the European Court of Justice extremely successfully to preserve the passport for financial services when attempts were made to take it away by some of the new Eurozone members. I'll only give way once, because we're all going to be very short of time in this debate, but not for the first time I give way to my right honourable friend.
To assure my right honourable friend, there are a number of things we want to change pretty quickly. The common fisheries policy needs to be changed in the interests of Britain, and we'd like to impose our own VAT on the products we think appropriate.
If anybody has an alternative fisheries policy they've worked out, we're going to follow. I look forward to a full debate on that subject, but I won't go down into that area at the moment. The point I'm making is that these three decisions were all interpreted as making it quite clear that it was the government's intention to leave the single market and to leave the customs union, because those three decisions, on the face of it, are totally incompatible with the principles which successive British governments have defended alongside the other nation state ever since the Thatcher government took the lead in creating the single market. And we have always been extremely forceful in our demands that other member states should follow the principles which we were repudiating at the party conference. Now, as it happens, what was also surprised me, and I know I've got right honourable and honourable friends in this House who agree strongly with all three of those propositions, but they were announced as government policy without a word of debate in this House of Commons, and I know, without a word of collective discussion in any cabinet or any cabinet committee. They were just pronounced from the platform, and wasn't a very good start, in my opinion, on this difficult subject. And we all saw the consequences of the perfectly sensible reaction outside. This meant the starting point for negotiations was leaving the single market and the customs union. I take them to mean that. The three statements are incompatible with everything that's been there before. If I was a French politician, a German politician, Polish, Spanish, or Italian, I would look at that list and I would say, and probably declare to the Parliament, if I was in the Parliament, well, that makes it perfectly clear that the British are going out of the single market and the customs union, and we're going to have to determine on what basis we can go back to some lesser access. The reaction in the markets was only too obvious, and it's continued ever since, with continued pronunciations of uncertainty, which is holding things back very badly. The pound has devalued to an extent which would have caused a political crisis 30 years ago when I first came here, not for the first time. Well, that was regarded as a political crisis. I'm sure my honourable friend did not welcome the ERM and say what a triumph it was to see sterling collapse as it did. No. The present position, this uncertainty, although we've got to go to March, we do need to clarify some things, because it is not helping. Nobody is going to invest in this country in any international project until there is some clarity about what our relationship is with the outside world. Anybody who just thinks that devaluation is a good thing and thinks Black Wednesday was White Wednesday, I could not disagree more. The situation is we have now devalued by 40% since 2006, and the effect, and nevertheless, we have the biggest current account deficit in this country's history. So the stimulating effect to exports has had its limitations so far. And I think we should ask ourselves the question, what is raised by all this? Now, it is said, well, it doesn't matter. It's all the referendum. The public have spoken, and all these things were determined. Indeed, the Secretary of State, who actually shifted quite a bit from where I thought he was going to be a couple of days ago when I first saw the government's motion, but he still starts by saying, oh, the people have spoken, all these things are now decided. Well, I don't accept that. Firstly, these issues were not addressed during the referendum. And the national media, the debate on both sides, in my opinion, was pathetic. how many millions of Turks were going to come here, or how far income tax was going to go up and health service spending be cut, depending on which way you went, achieved rather more prominence than the details of the customs union and the single market and its effect on any part of our economy. And no two Brexiteers agree, even today on these benches. There are firm Brexiteers who think you obviously need the single market, and there are firm Brexiteers who think, oh no, you don't have to do that. And it's so important to German car manufacturers and wine exporters that we can stay in the single market. And actually that more reflects the debates I've had with Eurosceptics over the years. The one thing I have never previously disagreed with any of my Eurosceptics friends about in the Conservative Party is free trade. They absolutely enthuse with their belief in open markets, free trade, the removal of barriers. Indeed, the other new Secretary of State, who's going to be responsible for trade relations with the rest of the world, made a speech about the benefits of free trade and globalization, which made me sound like a protectionist only a few moments ago. So I don't think there's a mandate for saying we're pulling out of the completely open access we have at the moment to a 500 million market, one of the most of sophisticated, wealthy consumers, and we feel perfectly free now to go on a voyage of discovery to see how much of that we can retain. Anybody tells me, my constituency voted in favour of remaining, but anybody who tells me there was a mandate in favour of that amongst the Leave camp, that 17 million people voted for that, is, I think, going to be greeted with a certain amount of disbelief. And I therefore think it is a pity that the Secretary of State was obviously still quite unable to say whether the objective of the government is to stay in the single market or in the customs union or not. He gave great assertions. I'm delighted to hear they will be seeking to negotiate to maximise the best interests of the UK and the British people. That is very reassuring, and he hopes to get the best terms he can possibly get on access. But actually every other member state will make it quite clear to its parliament, its people, what attitudes it is taking during these negotiations towards the single market, and we are not. We are making progress. So I'll conclude on this, so I've kept to my limit. We are making progress. This government amendment is a step forward, which I did not expect to see, and I welcome it. I would have voted for the Labour Party's motion. We still have got no offer of a vote, and we need some clarity about the policy the government's going to pursue, because the government is accountable to this House for the policy it pursues in negotiation.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman, and I think I will try and pick up where he left off because of the time limit. I also want to congratulate my right honourable friend from the front bench for, if I can put it this way, a first-rate speech in the debate. And I also welcome the progress that has been made, as the right honourable gentleman said, in the last 48 hours. But in my view, we still have a significant way to go, because I believe that nothing less than a vote on the government's negotiating strategy before the commencement of those negotiations will do. And I want to explain why to the House. The honourable member for Wellingborough intervened earlier and said this was a sort of fuss about nothing, or indeed some people might say it's a fuss about procedure. This is not about procedure. This is about the country and whether Brexit works for the country or not. And I particularly want to address those on the opposite benches, because they will have a decisive role along with my side in determining whether we get the scrutiny and the vote or not. And I want to start, Mr. Speaker, where we should begin, which is the state of the country. Let's be honest about this. The state of the country is deeply divided. And we were divided by the referendum, and we still are divided. Many leavers were delighted by the result, but are anxious about what is going to come next. Many remainers are desolate about the outcome, and fearful about the outcome, about the demons that have been unleashed. And both sides have reason for their feelings. And let's be honest, this is not a good state of affairs for the country. Now, the Secretary of State and the government say they want to create a national consensus. Well, I agree that we need to create a national consensus, and it's up to all of us to try and heal the divisions. To create that consensus of the 52% and the 48%, let's be honest, it's going to be difficult, but it is what we should try to do. Now, from my side, Remain, and for my part, Mr. Speaker, I believe it means we should accept the result of the referendum as part of trying to bridge that divide. The people voted, and we should accept the result. But if I can put it this way, the humility of those who lost should be matched by the magnanimity of those who won. So as I think about my responsibilities, I absolutely do think, as my honourable friend said, about my constituents who voted to leave the European Union. I do say to the people who voted for leave and were successful, they should think about the Remain people in our country, and I'm sure they do, who feel lost and wonder, is there a place for them in Britain after Brexit? Okay. So responsibilities lie on both sides. And if I can say in passing, Mr. Speaker, we should stop impugning the motives of each other. The vast majority of people who voted to leave did not do so because of prejudice. And if I can put it the other way, those who are now advocating proper scrutiny and consent for this Parliament are not doing so, as the Daily Mail says today, but we want to reverse the vote. It's for much deeper reasons than that. It's about the mandate, and the mandate from this referendum. So we need to put behind us the labels of Remain and Leave, but that is the beginning. Because if the government is serious about creating a national consensus, well, how do you do that, Mr. Speaker? You've got to take the country on this new journey with you. This cannot be the political equivalent of the country being put to sleep for 2 years in an anaesthetic and waking up in a magical new land. That has never been the way our democracy worked, and it's certainly not going to work on an issue as big as this. So we need a government willing to be transparent and consultative with the people and indeed this House. And I actually think, I know the Secretary of State's not here, I think even he believes this. Because it is significant that 3 days before his appointment, he was saying we should have a pre-negotiation white paper. He was even implying in this article, which bears reading, that it would strengthen the government's negotiating hand. And I think it would actually, particularly if there was consent from this House for the government's position. And also, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't it be an irony if the people who in this referendum argued for the sovereignty of Parliament, and I don't doubt their motives and their beliefs, but if their main act was to deny the sovereignty of Parliament in determining the outcome of these Brexit negotiations. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to deal with the 4 arguments that have been adduced for why Parliament should not get a vote in this referendum, because I don't think any of them stand up to scrutiny. The first argument is, well, we've had a referendum. Correct. We've had a referendum, but as my honourable friend said so eloquently, the referendum determined we're leaving the European Union. And to those who say, well, it was absolutely clear the form of Brexit we would have, I would point this out. The Secretary of State himself advocated in 2012 that we should remain a member of the customs union. So if it was so clear that we were leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, why was the Secretary of State advocating the opposite position just 4 years before the referendum took place? The second argument is an executive power argument. Now, the Secretary of State, of course, can't make that argument with a straight face, because he published a bill, and it is an extraordinary bill, as my honourable friend said, and it should be distributed to all members of the House, all about the need to control the executive, and all about the fact that unless it was set out in statute that the executive had this power, then there needed to be the consent of this House. And look, on something as big as this, with these huge questions about our membership of the single market, about our place in the world, that surely is an issue that needs the consent of the House. The third argument is a secrecy argument. I think this is, as the Foreign Secretary might say, baloney as well, Mr. Speaker, because the reality is these negotiations will leak. As sure as anything, and we'll end up in the position with the only people not knowing what our starting position is us. We'll find out and we'll read it in the newspapers. If there's any abuse of the House of Commons and the place of this House of Commons, that would be it. I give way.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. So does the right honourable gentleman think that we should be prepared to negotiate away some part of our control over our borders and over our money?
simplistic question, but on the substance of it, my position would be we should do everything we can to stay members of the single market, but we should also seek adjustments to freedom of movement. Now, the government's position is the opposite, which is the only thing that matters is immigration, and never mind if our economy goes off a cliff, as far as I can see, and I don't think that's a very good position. Now, the fourth argument is the red herring of the Great Repeal Bill. Mr. Speaker, I think the Great Repeal Bill should be renamed the Great Entrenchment Bill. Why do I say that? Because the plan, as the honourable gentleman knows, he's nodding from a sedentary position, right honourable gentleman, sorry, the Great Repeal Bill actually entrenches European law into British domestic law. So all of these laws that the Leave campaign and the Leave side have honourably objected to for so many years are actually going to be put into British law. Now, the notion, Mr. Speaker, that that is a proper means for this Parliament to take a view on the eventual outcome of the negotiations is also baloney, if I'm allowed to say that. In this House. So the four reasons that I've heard offered for why this House shouldn't provide consent, I don't think stack up. Now, there is another reason which could be the case, and I really hope it isn't, which is that the government doesn't like the answer that they will get if they ask the question of the consent of this House. In other words, they don't believe there is a majority for hard Brexit in this House of Commons. And so the thing they are desperate to avoid at all costs is getting the consent of this House. Because they think they're going to end up in a negotiation where they don't like the thing they're negotiating for. Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that is tough. Yes. Because they need the consent of this House and they need the confidence of this House on an issue as big as this, when there is no mandate from the referendum, no mandate from the manifesto, which, remember, said yes to the single market. There's certainly no mandate from that. No mandate for a Prime Minister who, let's not forget, was a Remainer. I know she was a silent Remainer, or relatively silent Remainer, but she actually advocated Remain. She didn't advocate Leave and was swept to power or surfing on a wave of euphoria because she was in the Leave campaign. She was in the Remain campaign. And that's the point I want to... I will briefly, yeah.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Does you think that there may be another explanation for the reluctance to put the matter to the House on the part of the government, which is they can't agree themselves what their opening position is?
Well, look, that might well be the case, Mr. Speaker, and you only need to read the newspapers to see that if debates aren't going on clearly about the government's position in this House, they're certainly going on within the cabinet. And I obviously think the Chancellor of the Exchequer seems to be in a slightly different position from some of his colleagues. I want to conclude, Mr. Speaker, because there are other people who want to speak in this debate. And I want to return to where I started. This issue goes so far beyond party politics and so far beyond whether we for Remain or Leave in this referendum. And it goes so far beyond our tenure of this House. Because the decisions we make in the next 2 or 3 years will have implications for decades to come. So I implore members on all sides, but particularly members opposite. I know there will be pressure. I know there'll be pressure not to speak out. Some of them honourably have done so. But I hope that we will hold to the best traditions of this House of Commons as we think about our duties, because our duties are not about procedure. I will very finally.
Absolute categorical assurance. I can tell him that as far as I'm concerned, my duty to my constituents transcends duty to party in this matter. And that, as I agree with him totally, that the effect of this change is so major that we each have to look at how we achieve the best result for our country.
I'm going to conclude because I want others to be able to speak. That is the point I will end on, Mr. Speaker. This is about getting the right outcome for the country. This is about creating the national consensus that the government says it wants. I am certainly going to play my part in doing that, and I urge other honourable and right honourable members to do that too.
Sir William Cash.
Speaker, I must say, in response to the right honourable gentleman, there are, of course, those who will not and never will accept the outcome of the referendum and will use almost any means at their disposal to try to overturn it or mitigate the result, while constantly and disingenuously stating their respect for the result. I think that is abundantly clear. This historic vote, Mr. Speaker, was an emphatic vote to leave the European Union. That was what was on the ballot paper. It was clear, and it follows from the fact that we're going to leave the European Union that Brexit does not just mean Brexit, it means the repeal of the 1972 Act, which incorporates and absorbs all the laws and all the judgments of the European Court and all the matters which have come into this House and been imposed upon us by the 1972 Act itself. I also would want to mention the fact that there's been some talk about the Conservative Manifesto. Well, I've got it here, and I'd just like to mention that because this is relevant not only to some remarks off by some of my colleagues, but also to the future conduct of this matter in relation to the House of Lords. The position is, and this is what it says in our manifesto, that for too long your voice has been ignored on Europe. Now, this is stated in 2015 and put to the British people. We will give you a say over whether we should stay in or leave the EU with an in-out referendum by the end of 2017. It then qualifies this by saying, because they don't know precisely what the date will be when the referendum would take place in 2015, and it makes some perfectly reasonable comments, such as, in the meantime, in parenthesis, they don't say that, but that's what it implies, to commit to keeping the pound and staying out of the Eurozone. Fair enough. To reform the workings of the EU. So long as we're in the EU, quite obviously we want to reform those workings, which is too big, too bossy and too bureaucratic. We will reclaim power from Brussels on your behalf and safeguard British interests in the single market. Well, I should hope we would during that interim period. And indeed back businesses to create jobs in Britain by completing ambitious trade deals and reducing red tape. And that is what the manifesto actually said. Now, that is the basis on which not only on which the general election took place, but it also is the basis on which the referendum took place, and the words in the question were quite clear. Do you want to remain in or leave the European Union? I'll certainly give way.
I don't disagree with Mother, but it also, he obviously skirted over it, he also gave a commitment in that manifesto, which he stood on, to remain in the single market. So where is that now? Exactly.
I have to say that it said quite clearly in the wording I just read out, and it quite clearly applies to the duration, the intervening period between the actual result of the general election itself and the introduction of the referendum bill and then the referendum itself, that we would, and quite properly, safeguard British interests in the single market. And indeed we're going to have to continue, indeed we are going to have to continue to do that until we get to the...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must disagree with my honourable friend. I have the manifesto here too because I'm going to refer to it in my remarks. And it very clearly says we say yes to the single market.
That's right.
And there is no mention in the wording the gentleman has just used about there being an interim period in which the Britain would remain in the single market.
The right honourable lady has, I think, a slight problem here because, of course, when we repeal the 1972 Act, as we intend to do so, and I understand from the remarks that have been made both by the other side and by this side of the House, that there are those who will not want to resist the repeal of the 1972 Act, and I see my right honourable friend nodding ahead, and I'm grateful for that. It is simply not possible for us to be both in the single market on the one hand and to comply with the laws that are implicit in the 1972 Act itself. You can't be in the single market and apply the jurisdiction. The jurisdiction, I won't give way for a moment. You cannot be both in the single market and repeal the 1972 Act. The laws are part of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. But I will give way to the former Attorney General.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He would doubtless agree with me that what in fact is going to happen over the next 3 to 4 years is that we're going to get out of one treaty and replace it with at least another, if not a multiplicity of treaties. Part of the 13,000 to which we are currently bound internationally at present. And he may also agree with me that countries such as Norway participate in the single market, just as an example, without being members of the European Union.
Yes.
And doesn't that completely destroy the argument he's just been putting forward?
It does not, because the one thing that is implicit in what I've just said is that we would not be able to go into the European Economic Area for that very reason. We have agreed in the referendum, the British people have spoken, and they have said, and everyone round this chamber is saying, we respect their views, we accept what they're saying, and yet at the same time there are these weasel words coming in, which is somehow or other to imply that you can leave the European Union, you can repeal the European Communities Act 1972, and yet you can still be within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. It's just nonsense. It's political and legal nonsense. Now, I think I've given away enough, because I want to continue with what I have to say. I will come back to this, I'm sure, on another occasion with my right honourable friend. My position is abundantly clear, and it's absolutely correct. You cannot be in both the single market and repeal the 1972 Act. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, what this means when they answer the question was that by the consent of the voters, given by the sovereignty of this House, this Parliament agreed to give the right to the British people to transfer from the members of Parliament sitting here in this House today and beforehand the right to the British people to make the decision as to whether we stayed in or left. And that decision, Mr. Speaker, was taken by a majority of something of the order of 6-1. It is simply, in my judgment, unseemly, if not absurd, for the same members of Parliament then to say, oh, well, we didn't like the outcome of the result, or we think, and then to say, we are now going to mitigate or try to overturn it. And on the question, if I may, Mr. Speaker, no, I'm not giving way at this stage. In relation, Mr. Speaker, to this question of the whether or not under the terms of this motion we are actually going to have a decision or a vote on the issue of trade negotiations before the triggering of Article 50, I would simply make this point, because this is at the heart of this debate today, on the surface of it anyway, and that is that the Labour Party and the Labour government did not do that. There was absolutely no attempt and there was no decision taken by the then Labour government to have a similar kind of condition imposed on the negotiating deal back in 1971, nor indeed for that matter in October 1971. So neither in 1975 nor in 1971 was there any attempt to prejudge the outcome of the negotiations. And I think that that speaks for itself. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
The honourable member has accused us of being disingenuous and unseemly if we express concerns over the consequences of leaving the European Union. I represent a constituency, Erdington, rich in talent but one of the poorest in the country. Home to the Jaguar factory, doubled in size over the last 5 years, transformed the lives of thousands of local people. It is absolutely correct that we express their concern and that of the company that if you've got an industry producing 1.6 million cars a year, 57% exported to the European Union, unless we are in the single market, the consequences for companies like JLR and for JLR workers could be very serious indeed.
So I'm so glad that the honourable gentleman is standing up so well for his constituents, and I always admire that, and have tried to do so myself. In my own constituency, it was around 65% to leave the European Union. In Birmingham, to which he is referring, it was also to leave the European Union. So I do hope he has due regard to what his constituents have said, because they were for coming out. And I now want to also deal with this question of the assertion that somehow or other there might be a diminution in parliamentary accountability and parliamentary scrutiny. Of course, there will be debates, there will be questions, there will be select committees. Indeed, there is going to be, we all know, a new Brexit committee, the motion for which is before the House, and there'll be a new chairman, there'll be elections about that. The idea that this Parliament is not going to scrutinise and hold the government to account on all these matters, and I don't actually have the slightest objection, if I may say, and nor should anybody else, to the questions that are being put today or any other day. This is what Parliament is all about. Parliament doesn't like, some parts of Parliament don't like the outcome of this referendum. But the point about it is this, that the question itself and the vote to leave was emphatic. And that is not something that can be gainsaid, in my judgment, by attempting in some way or another to try to reverse the result. Because we all know who the usual suspects are, and I'm not looking at one in particular. All I'm saying is that it is clear that there are people, and there are loads of them on the Labour side, who actually can't bring themselves to accept the outcome of this result. But I do, well, in that case, I expect to hear unequivocally from the front bench, when there is a wind-up, when this debate is winded up, a categoric assurance that under no circumstances will any member of Parliament on the opposition benches vote against the second reading or try to undermine the repeal bill when it comes through. The bottom line is they won't give that assurance, it sounds to me, but I'd be interested if they do. And the other point I simply want to make, and I'm going to conclude with this, is that this historic vote was giving the opportunity to the people of this country to make a massive decision, one of the biggest decisions taken for generations. We in this Parliament have had a democratic sovereign Parliament which has made a decision to give the vote to the British people. It is actually much simpler than it sounds. This was not about the shenanigans of whether or not vote leave misrepresented people or whether the Project Fear. This was decided by the British people, and in my judgment they paid less regard to the campaigns and a lot more to their own judgment. The British people got it right, and it's our job to respect it.
Mr. Nick Clegg. Following those remarks from the Honourable Member for Stone, I'm reminded how many fixed points in British politics have changed and changed utterly over the last several months. When I used to stand behind that dispatch box, the Honourable Member for Stone and many of his other fervent Brexiteers, I could always rely on them to marry their loathing of the European Union to their passion for the traditions and prerogatives of this House. That was their raison d'etre, that they hated Brussels as much as they loved the House of Commons. They still hate Brussels, but they now appear to be completely tongue-tied, completely mute, silent, when they have an opportunity to speak up for the traditional prerogatives of this House. My old friend and foe, it's a pity he's not here, the Honourable Member for Wellingborough. I mean, he, poor man, was reduced a few minutes ago to giving this sort of obsequious feather duster question to the Secretary of State, rather than actually taking the opportunity of saying that this place, in keeping with the greatest traditions of the mother of all parliaments, should hold this government to account for what it's going to do now, since the government does not have a mandate on how to exit the European Union after the referendum on the 23rd of June, and that is what is at the heart of this debate today. The other thing I would observe is, as the Conservative government, who would have thought, a government of the Conservative Party, the party of tradition, of the venerable principles of parliamentary representative democracy, as they tiptoe away from those great traditions that they once espoused, they are doing two things. First, they are reinventing history, and secondly, they are willfully ignoring precedent. And if I may, I just want to say a few words about that. Firstly, reinventing history. We heard it today. We heard it from the Secretary of State on Monday. Apparently, the referendum on the 23rd of June was an overwhelming vote in favour of Brexit. Apparently everyone voted, well, except for, of course, a few misguided members of the Liberal elite. Everyone else apparently voted Brexit. It was overwhelming. No contest. Now, you know, search me. For me, the dictionary definition of overwhelming does not conform to actually a very narrow vote in which one side got 17.4 million votes and the other got 16.1 million votes. Search me, that's not, I think, an overwhelming mandate. But the reinvention of history continues. Now, apparently, the government, unique in this land, has a telepathic ability to tell us
all the varied reasons that those 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. Extraordinary. It's particularly extraordinary since they never ever deigned to tell a single member of our wonderful country what they actually think Brexit means, because they couldn't agree amongst themselves then, and they still can't agree now. But nevertheless, with astonishing telepathic hindsight, they can tell us whatever, and apparently everyone voted en masse for exactly the same thing. Yes, of course.
Will he not accept that the one thing that Brexit means is that we are leaving the EU? Will he not accept that? And will he not say on the floor of this House that he accepts that? He's not going to try and contravene that. He's not going to try and subvert it.
As the Secretary of State said earlier, being outside the European Union, Turkey, Switzerland, Norway, means a multitude of different things. That is now the challenge for the government. That is what the Brexiteers cynically withheld from the British people in the run-up to the 23rd of June, because they couldn't agree amongst themselves, and that is why this House now needs to hold this government to account. But not happy just with reinventing history in terms of the so-called overwhelming vote of actually a very close vote. Not content just to apparently have this telepathic wisdom with hindsight about why everyone voted, they now also cast aspersions on 16.1 million of our fellow citizens who didn't agree. Exactly. And I find it extraordinary, quite extraordinary, that the Prime Minister of our country, with no mandate of her own, had the gall to get up in front of her own party conference and basically imply that if you believe, as I believe, that we have a natural affinity, not just with one another here, not just with our constituents, not just with those communities we inhabit here, but with people living in other countries, in other time zones, in other hemispheres. In other words, if you feel there is something called British internationalism, which I believe to be a proud, liberal British tradition, you are apparently, according to her, a citizen of nowhere. I really think any government that insults over 16 million of your fellow citizens is not a government capable of uniting a country which was so starkly divided on the 23rd of June. I give way.
To the right honourable gentleman for giving way. There seems to be a developing theme here that the people who voted to leave weren't clear exactly what it was they were voting for. Does he not recall the very clear warnings given by the then Chancellor and the then Prime Minister that voting to leave meant leaving the single market? They made that very clear. And does he also agree that leaving the European Union cannot mean the continuation of free movement and the application of European law that membership of the free market would require?
In direct answer to your question, I personally think it's an unfashionable view that with a bit of fancy diplomatic footwork and some political intelligence, actually the government could negotiate retention of our membership of the single market and curtailment of freedom of movement. What this government cannot do, and that's funny enough where the Honourable Member of Stone was correct, what you cannot do is have membership of or untrammelled access of a marketplace of rules and not abide by the rules. That is what is impossible. But that wasn't a contradiction from the British people. That is the contradiction of this government, which is a self-inflicted one. But if I may proceed, precedent. Precedent is very important. Many people have talked about the history of this place, the history of the relationship between the legislature and the executive. Why is it that no one on the benches, the government benches, has cited the very important precedent, in my view, of John Major when he was Prime Minister and he was faced with a very, very tricky negotiation on the Maastricht Treaty, and he took a very courageous, and it was not a risk-free decision, he took a courageous decision to come to this House and say, this is what I want to negotiate on behalf of the United Kingdom. Do you agree or not? And there was a vote on the or a debate, and then a vote on the 20 and 21st of November 1991. That was a stance taken with courage and delivered with clarity. Where is the courage? Where is the clarity? Where is the willingness to put the country before party from this government? It is truly a shame that that example set by John Major is not being followed by her followers now. And if I may, just make some progress on one final precedent, which hasn't been mentioned in this debate yet, but I think I both have personal experience of, and also I think has a direct bearing on the debate here. And it happened in the coalition government when I was Deputy Prime Minister. And a Secretary of State, I'll come in a minute to who that was, came to me and said, look, I have to, on behalf of the government, negotiate a very, very tricky deal with the rest of the European Union. It was all to do with the so-called JHA opt-out. I'm sure the Honourable Member for Stone could give us a great treatise on it. As you will remember, under provisions negotiated by Tony Blair, the United Kingdom fell automatically out of a bunch of crime-fighting and so-called judicial and home affairs cooperation measures, and then we had to decide as a country which ones we were going to opt back into. And there was a great tussle and argument between the two parties in the coalition. I wanted us to opt into more, the Conservatives didn't. Anyway, but I was told by the Secretary of State that the absolute one indispensable requirement for the Secretary of State was that at the beginning of the negotiations there needs to be a full debate and vote on the mandate for the coalition government to then negotiate with the other member states. Yep. And at the end there should be another debate. And these took place. I'll give you the date, actually. I've got the dates right here on my scrawny little piece of paper. On the 15th of July 2013, that debate and vote took place on that complex negotiation on the JHA opt-out, and the concluding vote on the final package, as we as a coalition government, when bringing it back to the House, took place on the 10th of November 2014. The House may be interested to learn that the Secretary of State, who was so adamant at the time on a debate and a vote on that negotiation, was none other than the Prime Minister today. Now, this is significant. And this is the final point I want to ask, the question I want to ask of the ministers in their place now. If it was justifiable for the House of Commons to have not only a debate but a vote at the beginning of a negotiation and at its conclusion for something as significant but nonetheless comparatively narrow as the JHA opt-out, why on earth is the government not coming here today and granting the House exactly the same rights and prerogatives for something which is immeasurably more significant and, as so many people have said, will have a bearing on life in this country for generations to come?
Mr. John Redwood.
Mr. Speaker, some colleagues have already said that it must be our duty now to try and knit our nation together and put behind us the heat and fury of the referendum campaign, and to see how together we can build a prosperous and successful future for the United Kingdom as the country leaves the European Union. And I think that is easier than the tone of this debate so far would give you to believe, because I have great confidence in the British people, and I've spent a lot of time talking to Remain voters both before and after the referendum, as well as obviously encouraging the Leave voters whose cause I helped champion. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is that the Remain voters on the whole are not passionate advocates of the European ideal and the European project. And that is why we can put it together. Around 10% of all voters in Britain, according to polling, really believe in the whole European project, perfectly noble vision of integration, political union, monetary union, borderless society and so forth. But that is a very small minority in our country, and I'm afraid we cannot easily build a bridge to those who want to be part of a united Europe, because it is very clearly the view of both sides in the referendum that Britain didn't want to be part of the single currency and the political union and the borderless Europe and so forth. But it does mean that an awful lot of Remain voters, the overwhelming majority of Remain voters, voted Remain not to join the full project, but because they had genuine fears and worries that when we came out of the European Union, we would leave the single market, and they felt that that could be damaging to trade, investment and business prospects. And I think it is on that narrow point that the House of Commons has to concentrate its activities over the next few months, because I think it is on that central issue that those discussions we're going to hold in due course with our European partners need to concentrate. And I'm very conscious that the business community has one aim above all others, and that is to reduce or eliminate uncertainty. Now, having been in business myself, I know that business is about managing uncertainties all the time. But of course it is good if you can get the politicians to make their contribution to lower uncertainty rather than increase it. And it is very important we all work together to try and reduce the uncertainty and shorten the time in which the uncertainty is taking place. And I'm very conscious that the way that you lower uncertainty is in two ways. As you approach the discussions or the negotiations, you first of all have to show that you are going to go at a lively pace, Because the longer it drags on, the more the uncertainty develops, the more obstacles there are, the more confusions, and the longer the delays that can hurt. So I think we need pace. And the second thing you do to reduce the uncertainty is you say that we only need to discuss a limited number of things, that we can narrow the framework of the negotiation. So to all those consultants and advisors who are sitting out there who say, what we want to do is to scope, as they would say. We want to chart every aspect of all our relationships with other European countries, be they technically single market or EU or wider, and then we want to put them all on the table, throw them all up in the air, and discuss which ones change and how stable they're going to be. And that would be a disastrous way to proceed. It would be too long, and it offers too many hostages to fortune. And the government is exactly right, that in order to have a successful negotiation which lowers the scope for danger and downside, you need to take it at a pace, but you also need to make sure that you don't say too much in advance about any possible weaknesses in your negotiating position. You don't open up issues for negotiation that don't need to be negotiated, and you only take on board those things which are a genuine worry to the other negotiating side and which are things that you need to take seriously because they have some powers over it. So the United Kingdom has voted to take back control. That was what Vote Leave was all about. That was the slogan. It was the slogan throughout the campaign. And when asked to define it more, the Leave side said take back control of laws and money and borders. And so we know what cannot be negotiated away. And we know that the main area of uncertainty or concern is how are we going to trade with the single market when we cannot technically be part of the single market, because the single market includes freedom of movement and it includes wide-ranging law codes over things that go well beyond the conduct of trade and commerce, and is generally defined and is not a segregated, integrated whole within the European Union. It is a central part of the European Union, and it is part of a very big consolidated treaty, a very big part of it. Good work.
The Secretary of State said something very interesting in his remarks, where he said he hoped to negotiate a better economic deal than membership of the single market. As a prominent Brexiteer, can he explain how that's possible?
Well, I don't recall the Secretary of State saying that at all, and I think what he was saying was that we can have a better relationship than simply relying on World Trade Organization rules. But I've got good news that if we were to have to fall back on World Trade Organization rules, this country would trade perfectly successfully with the rest of the EU and would be free to have much better trade deals with the rest of the world, which we have been impeded from having all the time we've been in the EU. And were there have to be tariffs, there would be many more tariffs collected on European imports into Britain, so we'd have a lot of money to spend, and we could give that money back to British people so they wouldn't actually be worse off as a result of the tariffs. Whereas, of course, going the other way, the tariffs would be a great embarrassment to our European partners. So I'm very optimistic about our European partners. I think they will want tariff-free trade. I don't hear Germany and France queuing up to impose tariffs on us, and so I hope we can get through that quite quickly and reassure them that we don't want to put tariffs on their trade either. I give way.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. And is it not also incumbent upon the government to be mindful that Article 50 wasn't put in the Lisbon Treaty to make it less complicated to leave the European Union, and that if we try and include too many things under Article 50 that stray into mixed competencies, we will finish up with an agreement that requires unanimity and a far more protracted negotiation than if we try and keep things simple. And in fact, it would be an advantage to business if we could complete this much more quickly than the 2 years specified in the Article 50 process.
Indeed, and Mr. Speaker, this is not a prediction, because I know there are a lot of people who have lots of good and bad reasons to want to delay and make it more complicated, but it would be quite possible to negotiate the trade issue very quickly, because we have two models that are available. My preferred model is we carry on trading tariff-free without new barriers in the way we are at the moment. It's the most sensible model to adopt. I think it makes even more sense for our partners, who are much more successful at selling to us than we to them, and I haven't heard them yet say they want to impose barriers. Or there is the WTO, most favoured nation model, which would be fine. We could do that fine. And if you wish to have a successful and quick and strong negotiation, you shouldn't want anything. And we don't actually want anything from our former partners. We want them to get on and develop their political union in the way that they want, where we've been impeding them. We want to be free to run our own affairs. We will do it in an orderly and friendly way. We want to have even more trade with our European partners. We want to have more investment agreements. We want to have more research collaborations, more student exchanges, all the other good things we already have. Those are not at risk, and there will be an enormous amount of goodwill from a more United Kingdom. Now, members opposite want to split us up by saying everything has to go wrong. If you wish to negotiate successfully, show confidence, show optimism, show that we can actually do this and be good friends with them.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. We have a shared and mutual interest with the other European countries in continuing research projects and continuing university collaborations. But that is part of the EU budget. So if we're going to do this, he's got to get off his high horse about not making any contributions to the EU budget.
Mr. Speaker, we will behave like all other independent countries of the EU and have lots of collaborations with them, and we will have agreements on those collaborations as need and requirement arises. But the important thing is that we will have taken back control. So I would urge the party opposite to understand this, that I and people like me are passionately in favour of parliamentary democracy. That's why we've waged the long campaign we've done so. I have every confidence that this Parliament will rise to this occasion. And today is a good example. The opposition have time. They've allotted it to this very crucial subject. They could have actually tabled a motion about the negotiations and the position they want to strike, but they're not yet ready to do that, and I understand that. But that was in their power. They could have put down a motion to try and veto an Article 50 letter if they'd wanted to, but I think they're very wise not to do so, because I think a lot of their constituents would see that as an attempt to thwart the will of the vote. But there is nothing stopping this great Parliament from doing exactly those things. And I'm very pleased that our Secretary of State has already done 2 statements and 2 investigations by select committees, and has been here in person today to answer an opposition debate. We don't always get the courtesy of the Secretary of State on an opposition day debate, and that augurs well for more scrutiny. And I'm very pleased that the main way we will be leaving the European Union is by repeal of the 1972 Act, because that means the central process will be a long constitutional bill, not long in length, I hope, in terms of the wordage of the bill, but long in terms of proceedings. So I'm sure the SNP in particular will want to cavil over every and comma in the piece of legislation, and they have every right to do so up to a point, and Parliament will consider it and will vote accordingly. And that is exactly as it should be. And it will be a great celebration of our parliamentary democracy, which the majority voted to strengthen, that we do it by parliamentary means, and thereafter all that European law, which the Right Honourable Gentleman, the former leader of the Labour Party, correctly said will become British law. That is the irony of it. We will do that for continuity purposes, but thereafter we in this House can make a judgment about whether it is wise and necessary to repeal or amend any part of that legislation. And if it has a direct bearing on our trade with the European Union, then of course it would not be a good idea to do that without knowing that they were happy or that they will not react unreasonably to it. So things like product standards or whatever, if you are selling into a market, you need to meet the customer requirements, and that of course will be part of what is reflected in that continuation of our legislation. And the other great news is the only thing about the single market that is really worthwhile, it's mainly very bureaucratic and expensive and pretty anti-enterprise, but the one thing that really works in the single market is it provides you with common product specifications and standards, so that if your washing machine is saleable in France, it's also saleable in Greece. And the great news is that when we're out of the EU, that is still true. It is an advantage for an American exporter into the EU as well as a UK exporter into the EU. And when we are in a similar position to America, an independent country very friendly trading with them from outside, we will get that full benefit. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let's bring the country together. Let's show we can be more prosperous and more successful. Let us show that our trade is not actually at risk. Let us be confident in our negotiation. Let us not use this place to make all manner of problems to give those who want to wreck our negotiation good comfort or support an extra research. But let us show how everything we can do can create more jobs, more trade and more investment.
Can I just say, after the next speaker, it will be dropping to 6 minutes, but for this one, it is the President to raise it. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. May I say gently to the right honourable gentleman, listening to what he just said about the single market, one could easily forget that the late Baroness Thatcher was one of the great advocates of the single market. And I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, what the debate thus far has demonstrated is that some members find it rather difficult to leave behind the arguments and the stances taken during the course of the referendum. But we must, as my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, pointed out, we have to respect the decision of the British people. We have to implement it. We have to negotiate an agreement that works for the whole country. And in seeking to do that, we have to try and heal the wounds and calm the fears that have been created, in particular on the part of the 48%. I will give way.
Grateful just because he said that the late Baroness Thatcher was a fan of the single market, and he should know, as her advisor, I advised her on it, and I advised her not to give up the veto in order to create it. She didn't accept my advice. I think she came to regret that.
I thought she was perfect. Well, I think the House is grateful for that history lesson, and I hope the right honourable gentleman will forgive me if I don't take his advice either on some of the arguments that he has advanced in his speech this afternoon, though I respect the position that he has long held. Now, I support the calls from all sides of the House for proper scrutiny and accountability, given the scale of the task that we face, and that was set out very clearly by my right honourable friend who opened the debate. The basis on which we're going to trigger Article 50, continued access to European markets for our industries, future arrangements for immigration, and maintaining cooperation with our European neighbours in areas where that cooperation has benefited both. And I think there are four things that we need to think of as we undertake this task. One is to minimise uncertainty, a word we have heard a great deal of in this debate. Secondly, clarity about the timing and the content of the negotiations. Thirdly, protecting the things that we value that have come from Europe. And fourthly, thinking creatively about how we build a new kind of relationship with Europe as we leave the institutions. I will give way. Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend. The Secretary of State said he wanted to minimise uncertainty, and he must reflect and give himself marks out of 10 on how he thinks he's doing at the moment. But just to take one example, the British Chamber of Commerce in Germany tomorrow is hosting a conference here at Westminster on the impact of Brexit on the City of London and the financial services sector. One of the issues preoccupying them is that of passporting, and it is uncertainty on this issue that is already creating bad decisions on employment and investment for this country. And would my honourable friend agree that it's in these crucial areas that the government must address uncertainty?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that point. I shall come on to address it in a moment. I was just going to say that some of the uncertainty is, of course, inevitable and will not be resolved until the negotiating process has been concluded, but some of it is the result of different things being said, one has to acknowledge, by different members of the government, as well as by the things that have been left unsaid, which may lead others to draw conclusions and then act upon them in the absence of clarity. Now, the announcement, for example, by Nissan that they're not going to invest any more in this country without guarantees from the government is indeed unwelcome, but it is entirely understandable because what car manufacturer, and my honourable friend talked about Jaguar Land Rover, is going to invest in additional capacity if there is still some doubt that we might leave with no agreement on trade and tumble out on WTO terms, which would lead to those cars facing a tariff. Now, I accept that we are likely in the end to get an agreement in which there are no tariffs on manufactured goods, but frankly, the sooner that can be made clear, the better. Now, there are those who argue that it would be perfectly possible within the 2 years provided by Article 50, not only to negotiate the mechanics of our withdrawal, and that's quite a task, but also to conclude a new trading agreement that will give access to the single market for our goods and our services, which haven't been much talked about, but my honourable friend raised the point. 80% of our economy depends on services. Now, they may be right, but I somehow doubt it. And if I'm going to not take any more interventions because there's many other colleagues who want to speak. If that is the case, then we will clearly need a transitional agreement to cover the time after we have left the European Union until the moment when a final agreement on trade and market access has been reached. Now, I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State had to say about that when I asked him a question on Monday,
But I think the government needs to say now, explicitly, that if we have not been able to conclude such an agreement by the end of the 2 years, and there is absolutely no guarantee whatsoever that all 27 member states will agree to extend the period, then we will seek that transitional arrangement, because that would help to boost business confidence. Now, the second aspect of uncertainty is its impact upon people. Now, unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks, a number of statements have been made about EU nationals and overseas workers here in the UK. I welcome the fact that it now appears that there is not going to be a requirement on companies to publish lists of overseas workers, but there was a reference made to overseas doctors who make a huge and important contribution to the NHS being able to stay here for an interim period until such time as we've trained more doctors in Britain, which is a good thing. I think it was unwise to talk about overseas students as if they are a problem to be cracked down on, and I think it was a mistake to describe EU citizens who are living here and working here and paying tax here as a card to be used in negotiations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, words matter. They are not a card, they are people. And they listen intently to what is said because they realise that ministers are talking about them. And they take it personally and they feel unwanted. And I say, I think it is very damaging to our reputation as a country that has always welcomed people who want to come here to work, to study and to contribute. Now, I say that accepting that the 52% who voted to leave did send us a message about their wish to control immigration from the EU. Although many of the people I spoke to in the course of the referendum campaign accepted, in arguing that there would be a continuing need for workers to come and to bring their skills and to contribute to our society in so many different businesses and sectors. So I would encourage ministers to offer as much reassurance as possible now to those EU citizens about their likely future status, recognising, because it's in our own self-interest to do so, that the way in which we approach that matter will have an impact on the spirit in which the other 27 member states from which those people come approach the negotiations that we are about to embark upon, and also to provide some clarity about how it plans to balance the desire to control free movement with continued access. I think I've run out of my minute, so I hope the Honourable Lady will forgive me if I don't. Clarity about how it proposes to handle the trade-off and access to the single market, given that we know from statements that have been made and signals that have been sent that the EU wants to set its face against any change to the four freedoms, and they've also made it pretty clear that they wish to demonstrate to us and through our experience to others, that there is a cost to leaving the European Union, all right.
Would the Honourable Gentleman agree with me? There is a very grave danger when we talk about immigration of extrapolating from the EU, the referendum result, that there is a desire to reduce immigration. The two great cities which have benefited and have overwhelming immigrant populations, London and Leicester, voted Remain.
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and it brings me very neatly to the point I was about to make about one of those great industries in our capital city, the impact of all of this on the services sector, including financial services, and the City of London, which is a network built on relationships and technology and agreements with the EU and through it with other countries. And it is, I would describe it as a delicate ecosystem, part of which is built on managing risk. So members of the House should not be terribly surprised if those who manage risk for a living, looking at the risks they think they might face from not getting an agreement that would allow them to carry on what they had been doing, draw their own conclusions about where they're going to put their business, where they're going to do their business, and where they are going to employ their staff in future. Now, on the Great Repeal Bill, I say to my right honourable friend, well, I had christened it the Great Incorporation Bill. So, entrenchment, incorporation, any more suggestions, and I trust it will make clear to workers that their employment rights will be protected, to people who care passionately about the environment, that the environmental protections that have come from our membership of the European Union will be maintained in future. Now, in all of this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there has to be transparency. And I accept the argument that it would be unreasonable for the government to reveal its detailed negotiating plan and its tactics prior to advancing its case in those negotiations. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is not the same as being unwilling to answer questions about what our negotiating objectives are, and it is not the same as being unwilling to share the assessments that the government has made about the possible consequences of leaving the European Union. So, on the first, some very simple questions. Does the government intend to remain in the Euratom Treaty? Does it wish to continue to be part of the European Medicines Agency, which, by the way, is based in London? Europol, the European Arrest Warrant. What about the European Aviation Safety Authority, the European Patent Office, and the European Banking Authority? Those are very straight questions about what is the negotiating objective of the government as it talks to the other 27 member states. And on the second, we all saw the story in the front page of the Times and the Guardian yesterday about this alleged draft Cabinet Committee paper that talks about the loss of GDP that we can expect and the detrimental impact on tax revenues. Now, it's good that the government is doing assessments. It'd be nice if they could be shared with the House as well as with the Guardian and the Times, because we need to know what the consequences are of the different options that are being looked at.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Speaker, the final point I want to make is about a new relationship with the European Union in the areas where cooperation has been to our mutual benefit, and in particular, security, defence and foreign policy, because I think it is essential. Think of the debate we had on Aleppo and Syria yesterday, that we continue to cooperate closely with our European neighbours, even though we are leaving the institutions of the European Union. So this is going to be a very complex and a very daunting process, and I do not envy ministers, because having to do this on top of all of the other demands of a ministerial job is not something any of us would relish. But it is our responsibility in this House, on all sides of the chamber, to make sure that we scrutinise and hold the government to account as they give effect to the decision that the British people have made. And since restoring sovereignty, and the point has been made, of this House was one of the main reasons advanced by those who said that we should leave, ministers cannot now argue that exercising sovereignty does not extend to the biggest challenge we've faced as a country since the end of the Second World War. So I simply say that when we get to the end of the negotiations, ministers need to understand that this House will take a view, this House must take a view on the nature of the agreement that the government has negotiated, because it's going to affect every single one of us and our children and all of the generations that will come after us.